Hi YouTube, it's Joshua Miles and welcome back to my channel. In today's video we're going to be taking a look at possibly the biggest case that I've ever covered on my channel. It's a tale of pain, mental illness and horrors from beyond belief. It was a case submitted to me through my requestacase.com website, which is where you can send in any case suggestions that you may have to be covered on this channel. You can also vote on existing cases posted there, which makes them more likely to be covered. Just head on over to requestacase.com and send them in there. And with that being said, let's delve into the horror case of Wayne Adam Ford. Victim 1. Sunday the 26th of October 1997, Myrtletown, California, the United States. A man by the name of Bob Potberg, who had been a photographer, had been kayaking with a few of his friends in the freshwater creek that runs around the northeast border of the neighborhood. It had been at about 4 p.m. that Sunday afternoon when Bob had kayaked around a bend just south of Murrayfield Airport when he noticed a white object ahead of him on the north bank. The white object contrasted against the neutral tones of the freshwater slough and its banks, and Bob was drawn to it. He kayaked closer to get a better look as curiosity started to get the better of him. And that was when the nature of this white object began to become clearer. It looked to have been the buttocks of a mannequin, or at least Bob hoped it to have been that of a mannequin. A deep fear, an instinctual urge to get away from the white object flooded Bob as the alarm bells in his head screamed at him that he'd been staring at a body. One of the friends that Bob had been with had worked at a local hospital, and so Bob asked her to go check it out, but she refused to do so as she too was petrified that it had been an actual body. Another one of Bob's friends had been kayaking with his 4-year-old child in the kayak, and his protective instincts kicked in, causing him to paddle further down the river away from the possibility of human remains in order to protect his toddler. Bob swallowed his fear and paddled closer to the white object until he had been within the right range to use his paddle to prod it. Bob hoped and prayed that when he prodded the object, he would hear and feel that it had been made of some kind of hard plastic or polystyrene or something synthetic. So when he felt the white object squish under the pressure of the paddle's prod, Bob freaked out. Bob also noticed that there had been a yellow material on the white object, and it dawned on him that this yellow had actually been exposed fatty tissue, as if body parts had been surgically removed. It was at that point that he called back to his friends that it had been real, and they called 911. Bob agreed to meet with an officer from the Eureka Police Department nearby, and when he spoke with the officer and described what he had come across, it appeared to Bob as if the officer was being dismissive by telling Bob that they found bodies in the slough every year. It wasn't until Bob explained that he hadn't just found a body, he had found a torso with surgical cuts, that the officer took him seriously. Though when Bob explained that the location of the body had been on the north bank, the officer held up his hands and stated that that was the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office responsibility and that they should be handling this case as the Eureka Police Department's jurisdiction had only been on the south bank of the slough. After what seemed like ages, the Humboldt County Sheriff's Lieutenant Deputy Coroner and an officer from the California Department of Fish and Game traveled by boat to the area where the torso had been to retrieve it. The torso was entered into the system as Jane 19498 Doe, but due to the torso missing the breasts, it was given the nickname of Torso Girl. It had been on the 27th of October 1997, the day after the discovery in the slough, that Detective Juan Freeman was assigned to be the lead detective on the case. Quote, "I was pretty sure I had the work of a serial killer in front of me. It had been Detective Freeman's first task to establish a list of identifiers of the remains, such as an approximate height, hair color, and the likes. These identifiers would be pinnacle in finding out who exactly their Jane Doe had been. Detective Freeman had hoped that the autopsy, which had been scheduled for the 29th of October, would shed some light on the investigation. The autopsy was conducted by pathologist Robert Lawrence, alongside a forensic anthropologist and skeleton expert by the name of Charles Cecil. The coroner, the coroner's deputy, a sheriff's deputy who worked in the coroner's division, and Detective Freeman were all also present for the autopsy. The autopsy itself took about 2 hours, and it allowed Detective Freeman to learn a considerable amount about the Jane Doe victim. It revealed that the Jane Doe had been a 18 to 25-year-old white woman with some possible Hispanic background. Further, it had appeared that the Jane Doe had given birth at some point in her life. She had stood at around 5'3" to 5'4" with brown or auburn hair. Using the levels of carbon in the Jane Doe's lungs, they were able to establish that she had come from an area with little air pollution and that Jane Doe had likely been a non-smoker. These were all important markers that could help Detective Freeman give Jane Doe her name back. The pathologist then looked closer at the wounds that had been inflicted upon the Jane Doe. We're not going to be examining this portion of the autopsy report in vivid detail, as I feel like you can get an idea of what Jane Doe went through without needing to discuss the particulars. What we will touch on though was that Jane Doe had suffered 27 stab wounds to the right side of her back and buttocks, with all but one having been inflicted after death. Notably and obviously, Jane Doe had been dismembered, and to sum up their findings, it hadn't been carried out with any surgical precision, and it appeared to have been carried out in a similar way that a hunter may dismember an animal carcass. When it came to examining if sexual assault had occurred, the pathologist was unable to find any trace of semen in or on Jane Doe's body. This had largely been due to 2 factors. The first being that her remains had been in the water of the slough for some time, and the second had been due to the fact that Jane Doe's genitals had been cut out of her body. The cause of death could not be determined. The investigation following the autopsy saw investigators using cadaver dogs to search the water and the banks of the slough to see if they could locate any more remains connected to Jane Doe. While the dogs did alert to some driftwood near where the body had been recovered, which they put down to the driftwood having retained the body's scent, no more remains were located. Detective Freeman submitted Jane Doe's identifiers to the Department of Justice's Missing and Unidentified Persons database. He initially asked research to be conducted comparing Jane Doe's characteristics against young women who were reported to have gone missing between the 20th of October and the 26th of October. Detective Freeman further made contact with FBI profilers and Department of Justice profilers and reached out to other agencies to see if they had any cases similar to his. And within a year, Detective Freeman had ascertained around 100 leads on missing women who could fit the profile of his victim, though whenever he tried to compare DNA, it had never come back as a match. On the 18th of December 1997, Detective Freeman met up with 2 profilers that he'd contacted from the state's Department of Justice. These 2 profilers had actually been asked to travel to Eureka in order to look into the case of Karen Mitchell for the Eureka Police Department, which was a case that was being ostensibly connected to that of the Torso Jane Doe case. Karen Mitchell had gone missing 5 days before her birthday on the 25th of November 1997. She'd been living with her auntie and her uncle Bill Casper, who had actually been the head criminalist at the State Department of Justice Crime Lab in Eureka. Karen had last been seen leaving her aunt's shop at the Bayshore Mall, walking along Broadway to the Coastal Family Developmental Center, which had been where Karen took care of children. It's my understanding that the authorities at the time believed that the person responsible for the disappearance of Karen Mitchell had been somehow connected and or responsible for the murder of the Jane Doe, dubbed as Torso Girl, found a month before Karen went missing. Karen's case is unsolved to this day, and I've left the link to the Charlie Project page on Karen's case in the description if you'd like to find out more information, or let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in my coverage of Karen's case. The 2 profilers that had travelled to Eureka to look into Karen's case also met with Detective Freeman with regards to the Jane Doe Torso Girl case, and they both agreed that they thought the 2 cases had been related. The 2 profilers theorized that the killer had likely been a white man in his 40s who had killed many times before, and who generally did not intend for his victims to be found. They further suggested that the killer in the Jane Doe case had been proud of his handiwork, and so had dumped the remains in a place where somebody would find her. The profilers believed that the killer had been someone who felt it had been safe to commit crimes without being caught while transporting the remains. That the killer had worked a regular job due to the the fact that the remains had been dumped over a weekend. Further, they suggested that the killer had lived nearby to Eureka, had been a frequent visitor, or had lived there before. They stressed that the killer must have had a crucial knowledge and understanding of the area, as he needed to be able to park close enough to this slough so that he wouldn't be seen dumping the remains. The profilers recommended that Detective Freeman should establish what had been in the stomach of the Jane Doe, as according to them, these types of murderers rarely had sexual intercourse with their victims. Rather, they typically forced oral sex, and so the stomach contents could contain semen with DNA evidence, though it must be noted that the pathologist had actually dumped the contents of the victim's stomach during the autopsy and trying to determine whether there had been pills in the stomach, so this was a lead that could not be realized. Finally, the two profilers requested that Detective Freeman should try to figure out where exactly the victim had actually been thrown into the slough. They hypothesized that there could be more body parts in a sunken container or something similar near to the site in which the remains were dumped into the slough. It was suggested that Detective Freeman pick a day in which the tides had been similar to that of the weekend the body was found, and then use weighted bags thrown into the slough from suspected dumping locations to see where the current takes them. If any of those weighted bags ended up close to where the remains were found, they had a strong contender for the dumping site, which should be searched for evidence. It wasn't long before a break was made in the case. On the 29th of January 1998, two people who had been cutting driftwood at the beach in McKinleyville came across a horror from their nightmares: a left arm, sunburned and dried out. This finding was immediately reported to the authorities, and Detective Freeman ordered DNA tests to see if the arm could be a match for either Karen Mitchell or their Jane Doe case. The hand of the arm was sent to the Department of Justice lab to see if it was possible to rehydrate the arm enough in order to take a set of usable fingerprints to compare against state and national fingerprint databases. Could they finally find the identity of their Jane Doe? The following day, on the 30th of January 1998, a team of investigators meticulously searched the shore from Clam Beach south to the Mad River, which flowed from the mountains through Arcata and emptied into the ocean near McKinleyville. However, no other body parts or remains were found. Detective Freeman waited on the edge of his seat throughout February and into March before he got the results back on the DNA from the arm, and it had been a match with the DNA of that of his Jane Doe torso case. It had also been reported that the left arm appeared to have been sawed partway through, which had been consistent of that of the marks found on their Jane Doe's left shoulder. This is where the investigation took a turn into the paranormal and spiritual realms, and in part due to the length this coverage is going to be, and also in part due to respect for the victim, I'm only going to briefly touch on this. Detective Freeman decided to consult with a psychic by the name of Kay Rhea, who he had actually consulted with before on different cases. Now, it must be noted that allegedly many of the details that this psychic had provided had turned out to be true, though she had offered these details in the wrong context. From Detective Freeman's report on this consultation, he wrote, quote, "Kay asked me to describe the general location where Jane Doe was found. I did this, and Kay told me the victim had dark brown hair, but not black hair." The psychic gave the detective a bunch of predictions that I don't personally feel to be respectful to include in this coverage, but I will leave you with this short extract from the reports. Quote, "Kay said that this person is not a serial killer type guy. She said his ability to have sex is low because he has a small penis." Okay, I can't believe I just said that on my YouTube channel, but okay. Bringing this coverage back to the realms of reality, Detective Freeman did attempt to use weighted bags to see whether they could figure out the dump site of the remains. Though, due to bad weather conditions, the exercise had to be cancelled in December, January, and in February. The next attempt had been on the 16th of March. Detective Freeman, alongside Deputy Roy Reynolds, had researched the area's tidal patterns and had filled about 18 burlap sacks with enough wood chips and empty plastic bottles to equate to the same weight as the Jane Doe torso. They then tried placing the bags intermittently along the slough. However, they actually ended up having to abort the exercise due to the fact that they had run out of time. And around the same time as this flotation experiment taking place, the coroner's office buried the remains of Jane Doe in Potter's Field, which is described as an indigent section of Ocean View Cemetery in Eureka. The experiment was conducted again on the 5th of May, though this time with a larger team to assist. They filled 21 gunny sacks and placed them in 4 pots of the slough where they believed the remains had most likely been dumped from. 2 out of those 21 sacks stood out to Detective Freeman: bag 14 and bag 18. Bag 14 had been placed near Park Street Bridge and had come to rest about 100 feet away from where the the Jane Doe torso had been located. Bag 18 had been placed near the Devoy Road Bridge, which is about 1.5 miles downstream from bag 14, and it also ended up where the Jane Doe torso was located. Though it must be noted that bag 18 took 3 complete tidal cycles for it to get close to the discovery location, and as it was believed that the remains had been in the water for less than 24 hours, Detective Freeman established that the Park Street Bridge was the more likely place to have been the dumping site. If the murderer had dumped the remains there at dawn on the 26th of October 1997, it would have been able to float to its final resting place by the time the tide went out that evening. After the experiments, the case's investigation grew colder and colder. In the year following the discovery of the Jane Doe, Detective Freeman determined a half dozen possible suspects through liaisoning with other agencies around the state, but none of the possible suspects would turn out to be the killer. Quote, "What I found out during this investigation is that a lot of people do really weird things." Detective Freeman had been deeply upset that throughout the years since the discovery of Jane Doe, they still hadn't been able to give the Jane Doe her name back. Victim 2. 6 p.m. on Tuesday the 2nd of June 1998, Buttonwillow, California. 4 men who had worked for a construction company reported finding the nude body of a woman hung up on the steel cable of alternating red and white buoys that spans the California aqueduct. 2 sheriff's deputies responded to the call, who confirms the reports of the human remains, and subsequently a homicide team was called in. The woman in the water appeared to have been in the water for some time, and so the authorities had been initially unable to identify the remains. Detective Gary Rhodes had received the call about the discovery at just before 7 p.m. The woman's body had been found about 40 feet downstream from the Highway 58 bridge, which crossed the aqueduct. The steel cable that the body had been hung up on had been meant to be a safety device for people who had inadvertently fallen into the water, and as the woman's body had been found in the nude and face down, Detective Rose determines that his Jane Doe hadn't accidentally fallen into the water while fishing. The detectives searched the banks of the aqueduct and the bridge for any kind of evidence, such as tire tracks or clothing, but they found nothing. There had been no obvious signs of foul play, such as a gunshot wound or stabbing, and so Detective Rhodes took photographs of the Jane Doe and then pulled her by the arm to the shore, which was where she was placed into a body bag. At around 9:30 p.m, the detectives had moved the remains into a van for transportation to the coroner's office to undergo an autopsy, though they had learned some initial facts about their Jane Doe. She had been 5'5", had blue eyes, and had reddish blonde hair. Quote, "The next day, a detective and an evidence technician went to the morgue in Bakersfield to try to roll a set of fingerprints, but her skin was too decomposed." The autopsy commenced 2 days after the discovery on Thursday the 4th of June 1998, and Detective Rhodes had been present alongside his partner on the case, Detective Taylor. The pathologist had been Dr. Donna Brown, and this is what she found during the autopsy. The victim had pre-mortem, so inflicted before death, dime-sized bruises to the left side of her jaw, along her cheek, had scrapes on her temple and chin, had a fractured neck, and the neck was circled with a linear mark, as if she'd been strangled by something, and had deep bruising in the cheek and in the voice box area. Dr. Donna Brown did conduct a sexual assault kit and took a blood sample in order to use in the future to try and match the DNA with a suspect. Of note, the Jane Doe victim wore 5 rings on her left hand and had a tattoo of the letters JJ in a heart on the web between her thumb and first finger. There'd also been a ring on her right ring finger. The pathologist removed the victim's hands and used a chemical solution to soak the skin of the hands in the hopes that it could improve the chances of obtaining fingerprints. It was through this technique that the investigators were finally able to ascertain usable fingerprints, which was entered into the Department of Justice's Western Identification Network and the FBI's databases. The detectives searched the missing persons files to see if they could find anything, but to no avail. It wasn't until the 29th of July that a break in the case was made, when a fingerprint was matched with a girl from Tacoma, Tina Renee Gibbs. Tina Renee Gibbs had been born on the 20th of April 1972 in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to parents Carlos and Mary. When Tina had been around 18 months old, her mother Mary took her and left Carlos in October of 1973 and went to Georgia. When Tina had been 7 years old, her mother Mary began a relationship with an Army police investigator by the name of Ron Sharp. Within months, Tina had begun to call Ron, quote, Daddy, and it wasn't long before Ron and her mother Mary would get married. According to reports, quotes, on all levels bar genetic, Ron had been Tina's father. As a child, Tina was described as someone who had been happy-go-lucky, a kid that loved going to the beach and singing, what her mother called oldies but goldies. Tina loved to play with her cats and enjoyed going fishing. She loved going to the carnivals and to the circus to watch the animals perform. It had been Ron, Tina's stepdad, who had taught her how to swim, and it had been Ron who had taught Tina how to play softball. As Tina became a teenager, she would begin to alternate between being what could be described by some as a girly girl and a tomboy. She would hang out with her mother, fixing each other's hair, crocheting together, going shopping and cooking together. And as Tina grew up, it had been her house that had become the place that Tina and her friends would hang out, playing pool and listening to music together. The family had stayed in Georgia until Ron decided to leave the army, which saw the family moving to Oklahoma for 6 to 8 months. Though Ron had quickly become bored of this slower pace and wanted to dive back into what he considered to be real policing work. The family of 3 then moved to the state of Washington. In 1991, when Tina had been 18 years old, Ron and Mary decided that they wanted to move to Oregon from Washington State. And Tina had decided that she wanted to stay put in Washington State as she had fallen in love with a man and she had decided that she wanted to stand on her own 2 feet. Tina's mother Mary saw this as cause for concern, as she knew in her guts that Tina had been experimenting with drugs and that she had fallen in with the wrong crowd. Ron, though, thought that Tina had simply grown up and that she was, quote, ready to rule the world. Quote, she called me one day and asked me if I would come and pick her up so she could come home, and that's when we found out that she was messing with drugs. We were her sole support. Anything that she wanted, we gave it to her. Mary and Ron both tried to talk Tina into counselling and to get her off the drugs, but they had not been successful. And their move to Oregon came round quickly. Once they had moved to Oregon, they only heard from Tina a couple of times a year. It's unclear at what point, but at some point, Mary and Ron moved to Oklahoma. When they did so, they lost contact with Tina completely. The last time that Tina's mother Mary remembered speaking with Tina had been in 1994, possibly on Christmas Eve. Mary recalled, quote, begging her to come home, and Tina had agreed to come home with her mother, but she sadly never followed through. Tina's mother Mary, in the years that followed, tried to track down Tina through her friends. She hung on to the hope that Tina might one day get her life together, knock on the door, or give her a call. We can only establish what Tina had gone up to in the years after that through the police records, which showed that she had been arrested more than a dozen times. Tina had been arrested 5 times for soliciting prostitution in 1995 and in early 1996, which was before she had moved to Las Vegas. The final arrest on her record had been in Tacoma on the 11th of January 1996. Detective Rhodes spoke to the Las Vegas Police Department and was able to confirm that Tina had been a sex worker in Las Vegas. Quote, the sergeant told me that all of her last addresses and places where they'd last contacted her were parts of the city known for prostitution at the time. Tina had last been cited by the police on the 6th of May 1998, which had been less than a month before her body was found, and she was cited after giving false information to a police officer, though these charges were dropped, quote, per negotiations. It had been in early August of 1998 when Tina's mother Mary had come home from work to find her husband Ron just standing behind the front door, as if he had been waiting for a while for her to arrive. Mary instantly knew that something was very wrong. You see, Ron had received a message to contact the coroner's office in Kern County, California earlier that afternoon, and the coroner's office had told Ron what they could, which hadn't actually been all that much at all, as they had mostly focused on what they wanted to do with Tina's remains. Ron had now been left with one of the most difficult jobs in the world, telling a mother, his wife, that her only daughter had been murdered. Ron told Mary to sit down on the couch before he told her the news in the gentlest way he could. Whatever Ron did, he would be unable to stop Mary from feeling what she described as, quote, the most gut-wrenching sorrow that a mother could feel. Mary actually ended up in the hospital the next day due to her body being overcome by the grief. The mental anguish had paralyzed Mary so much that she had to be hospitalized on 5 occasions for 4 to 6 weeks at a time. Mary would try to return, but she quickly realized that she couldn't handle it, and Mary would actually become medically disabled, and according to Ron, she would never be able to work again because of the sheer grief she experienced at the loss of her daughter. Victim 3. Friday the 25th of September 1998. 3 men pulled over to change a plug wire in a gravel turnout along Highway 12 near Lodi, just west of Interstate 5. The men quickly noticed in an irrigation ditch that had been parallel to the road that there had been the naked body of a woman floating. One of the men went across the street to an industrial building and asked somebody to call 911. And when the Delta Fire Department had arrived, all 3 of those men had left the scene of the discovery. The fire department contacted the sheriff's office, and when the deputies arrived, they ordered the firefighters to back their engines out in the exact same way that they had entered the turnout in order to not disturb the death scene any further. And once the firefighters had done so, the police cordoned off the area so that the homicide team could get to work. The body of the woman had been floating upright in shallow water near a large walnut tree. The investigators collected about 15 items from the death scene, including a brown leather glove and a plastic royal blue tarp, both of which were found floating near the body. Further, they collected a white plastic bag, which had come to rest against some weeds about 30 yards away from the body. The bag had been marked with what appeared to have been blood, and had a logo on the back for Flying J, which was a national chain of truck stops. This gave the investigators their first major clue. The killer might have been a truck driver. This was further supported by tyre tracks that had been left in the gravel, though the tracks weren't clear enough to identify the tyre pattern by brand. As the victim had been found in the water, the investigators had to call in the sheriff's boat crew to recover the remains. The victim's body showed no major visible wounds or bruises, which stood out as unusual to the investigators for a woman who had been dumped naked. They initially suspected that the victim had been strangled. The victim's hands were bagged by the investigators to protect them for fingerprinting before loading her into the van at about 4:50 p.m, where she was transported to the San Joaquin County Hospital to undergo full-body x-rays before being taken to the county morgue. It was at the morgue that the investigators were able to roll a set of fingerprints from the victim, which was subsequently entered into the California ID system, which can take up to an hour on a good day to get a hit. The autopsy of the victim was conducted the following day, on Saturday the 26th of September 1998, and the pathologist carried out a sexual assault kit and took 3 vials of blood. The autopsy reveals that the skin of the victim's neck had been marked with a chain-like pattern, and there had been no internal hemorrhaging beneath. An injury was found on the back of the head, though it had been unclear if it had been an old injury or a new one. Ultimately, the autopsy was unable to determine how exactly the victim had died. Quote, "We were hoping for something, a stab wound or something that said yes, it was homicide." Regardless, the investigation continued to treat the case as a homicide. It was determined that the state of decomposition may have masked some findings, with the detectives hoping that the cause of death may present itself once the tox screens returned. As they waited, the pathologist deems the cause of death to preliminary have been, quote, "homicidal violence of unknown ideology." Fortunately, the identity of the Jane Doe in this case would soon reveal itself due to the fingerprint search. The fingerprints returned a match for 25-year-old Lynette Dion White. Lynette Dion White had been born on the 11th of November 1972 in Upload, California, to parents Deborah and Bill White. She'd been the eldest of what would be 2 children born to the family, who lived together in a duplex in Ontario. Lynette's mother, Deborah, had stayed home to take care of Lynette, who was described as being a wonderful child, albeit a bit fussy, while Lynette's father, Bill, worked construction. Lynette had enjoyed the circus as a child, so much so that she had even dressed up as a bearded lady for her kindergarten class when it had performed a mock circus. She had also been athletic from a young age, having run track for her elementary school and practiced karate for 2.5 years. Notably, Lynette actually quit karate before she had earned a black belt after she had lost a tournament fight to a boy. She didn't think it was fair that girls had to compete against boys. When Lynette had been 13 years old, her younger brother was born, and she went from being an only child to having a sibling. Lynette used to go with her family to SeaWorld in San Diego together, and they even went to go watch drag races as a family. When Lynette had been in the 9th grade, she stopped attending school and would instead go to her aunt's house or ride about on her bike. It had also been at around this time that Lynette became what her friends and family described as, quote, boy crazy. And Lynette had been more enthusiastic about boys than most. The day after Lynette's 16th birthday, on the 12th of November 1988, Lynette gave birth to a daughter who she called Amanda. Lynette had parented this baby with her boyfriend at the time, a boy by the name of Robert, and it had been almost a year after the birth of Amanda that Lynette gave birth to a second child with Robert, who they called Carlos. In March of 1995, Lynette and Robert welcomed their third child, Michael, into the world. Now, it is important to note that in January of 1998, Lynette did have a another child by the name of David, but this child had not been the son of Robert. It's unclear when and why Robert and Lynette had split up. Though what we do know is that Lynette loved to cook for her children, especially Mexican food. Amanda, Lynette's eldest, would later describe Lynette by saying, quote, "She was really fun. Instead of a mother, she was more like a friend." You see, Lynette loved her family, but she was also described as somebody who loved to have a good time. And Lynette needed to find a way to pay for this good time. Lynette had been 21 years old when she had first been arrested on the 28th of September 1994 for trying to cash a stolen check for $500 at the Vineyard National Bank. It would be the first time of many that Lynette would encounter the law when it came to forged and stolen checks. Lynette would also be later described as someone who had parties to sell home interior products, being recorded by the police as being unemployed. Quote, "It was so unusual for Lynette to have any money, as she never worked and didn't have any means of obtaining a check." In January of 1995, a detective tried to reach Lynette by phone, but had been unable to, so he tried again in February, though this time he had gone to the apartments that Lynette shared with her parents in Chino, but to no avail. Subsequently, on the 7th of February, the detective put a, quote, "stop and hold" order out for Lynette. Lynette was arrested by 4 p.m. that same day and was charged with 2 counts of commercial burglary, 2 counts of forging checks, and 1 count of being under the influence of methamphetamines. Lynette ended up agreeing to a plea deal, which saw her sentenced to 120 days in jail and 3 years probation. She was allowed to serve her time in a weekend program from 7 p.m. Friday until 7 p.m. Sunday, though a month before Lynette was due to commence her jail time in November of 1995, which had been the same year that her 3rd child was born. Lynette was arrested again for being under the influence of methamphetamines. Lynette would find herself arrested yet again on the 13th of October 1995, in which she admitted that she had snorted, quote, "a little line" earlier that day. Due to her prior convictions, however, Lynette was ineligible to join the drug diversion program. In July of 1998, the San Bernardino County District Attorney's Child Support Division filed a complaint against Lynette in which they were seeking a monthly $370 in child support for her eldest child, Amanda. The last time that Lynette's mother, Deborah, had seen Lynette had been on the 16th of September 1998, 3 days before Deborah's actual birthday. Lynette had brought over a birthday cake to her mother's place and told her that she'd be back for her actual birthday to celebrate. Lynette had always been super thoughtful, especially around birthdays and other special occasions. It had been 7 days later when Deborah had got a phone call from her sister on Tuesday the 22nd of September. Deborah's sister told her that Lynette had gone to Baker's restaurant to pick up a check on Sunday the 20th of September and had never come back. 3 days later, on the 25th of September, an Ontario police officer arrived at Deborah and Bill's apartment and notified them that Lynette might have been, quote, "involved in a homicide," before urging them to contact the San Joaquin County detectives who had been working on the case. Bill, who was Lynette's father, had decided that he should go with his son to the payphone just down the street to make the call. Meanwhile, Deborah, who was Lynette's mother, went into shock. When Bill made the phone call, he was connected to Detective Mike Jones, who asked them if they knew why Lynette might have been up in Northern California. Bill told the detective that he didn't know why she'd been up there. Then the detective asked Bill where Lynette had been living. Bill told him that Lynette had been living in Fontana with her 2 youngest children, and that she'd been living with her cousin by the name of Charlotte. After a bit of further conversation, the detective became more serious before saying, quote, "Sir, well, I have some bad news for you. We found a young female in a waterway, deceased, near Lodi. We have tentatively identified her by fingerprints, and it is Lynette." Bill then went back to the apartment and broke the news to Deborah before they decided to tell Lynette's oldest child, Amanda. Sadly, Lynette's parents hadn't much money, and due to the state of decomposition that Lynette had been in, they decided that their only option had been to cremate her. The ashes were sent to them, and after they received them, they held a service for Lynette at a local mortuary. Quote, "I had to take my baby out of there in a box, holding her like that. I never thought I'd ever have to go through something like that. Your kids, they go from an accident, car wreck, stuff like that. But something like this, there's no excuse for it. No excuse in this world for it. On Monday, the 28th of September, Detective Mike Jones, the same detective who had notified them of Lynette's death, drove the 10-hour drive to Fontana. The detective arrived at Deborah's sister's house at around 7:45 p.m. and entered the home in order to ask Lynette's parents, Deborah and Bill, further questions. Deborah told the detectives that Lynette had lived with them up until the first part of September, which was when they had to kick her out, though Deborah did not elaborate as to why she had to kick Lynette out. The detective also spoke with Bill and took Bill out to the police car to show him a photo of Lynette's tattoos so that he could confirm her identity. The detective reassured Bill that he wasn't going to show him any photos of Lynette's face or anything graphic. The detective did warn Bill about what he was going to see, though, telling him, quote, "I'm going to show you a picture of her back. The picture is not pretty." Bill burst into tears after seeing what had happened to his daughter. Quote, "He's a pretty brave man, and I think it's messed with him ever since then. It's like he never used to cry very much, but now I always see him crying. I mean, he tries to act like he's not, but I know when he's crying. And it's just like, you know, a heartbreaking, awful, terrible thing for someone to have to go through." That same night, Monday the 28th of September, the detective spoke with the cousin that Lynette lived with, Charlotte Bailey. Interestingly, Charlotte admitted to the detectives that she had smoked a dime bag of meth on the last day that she had seen her alive. She further explains that Lynette had lived with her in Fontana for 3 or 4 weeks before Lynette had been murdered, and that she and Lynette had frequented a liquor store that was around the corner. It's important to note that just a couple of miles down the road from Charlotte's place in Fontana had been several truck stops, such as the Fontana truck stop, Three Sisters truck stop, and Truck Town. It is also important to establish that sex workers had been known to frequent these places. What isn't known is how Lynette actually ended up at one of those places, as they were far too far away to have walked there, especially in high heels. It had been through these interviews with Lynette's family and friends that the detectives managed to create a rough timeline of events on the day that Lynette went missing, Sunday the 20th of September. They had established that early that Sunday, Lynette and Charlotte had smoked some meth at their friend's house before returning back to Charlotte's place in the afternoon. Then, at some time between 5:15 and 6 p.m, Lynette had pushed her baby in the stroller to the corner liquor store in order to call her friend, who we'll call Darren, after which she had returned back to Charlotte's place with a bottle of Cisco. Another one of Lynette's cousins, who we'll call Lucy for privacy protection purposes, told the detectives that Lynette had gone outside the house and had spoken to a big guy in a white pickup truck as Charlotte had been taking a nap. This, quote, big guy was described as being a white guy, about 6 foot tall with greying hair, a thick mustache, and tattooed arms. Now, it's important to note that this guy would later be identified to have been a 52-year-old Ralph Edward Bishop III, and he would admit to having used 1/4 gram of meth every day, and that he could not account for his whereabouts on that night. At around 7:30 p.m, Charlotte awoke from her nap to see Lynette putting on a black and brown dress before setting back off for a second trip to the liquor store. Lynette would return from the liquor store with another bottle of Cisco. At about 9 p.m, Darren, who had been the friend that she had called from the liquor store earlier that day, showed up to Charlotte's house, and Lynette met him outside with a hug before sitting in his lap and kissing him in the front yard. Lucy, Lynette's cousin, had gone for a lie down and was awoken at around 10 p.m. when Lynette had turned on the hall light to change her clothes again. This time, Lynette got changed into a pair of tight faded jeans, a blue midriff tank top under a long-sleeved brownish plaid shirt, and a pair of black and white high-heeled sandals. According to Lucy, Lynette seemed to have been sniffling, as if she'd been crying, but Lynette didn't reveal to Lucy what exactly had been wrong. At this same time, one of Lynette's children also woke up and asked for some more milk, though they had been out of milk, and so Lynette said that she would walk to the liquor store and get some. That would be the last time that Lucy would see Lynette. At some point after Lynette had left the house, Charlotte was awoken by one of Lynette's babies crying. Darren, who was Lynette's friend who had come over, had still been at Charlotte's house, and he told Charlotte that Lynette had gone to pick up her check from Baker's restaurants, and then she was supposed to meet somebody at the liquor store to, quote, make some money. Interestingly, when the manager at Baker's restaurant was shown a photograph of Lynette, he said that he'd never seen her before. Darren woke up Lucy at around 11 p.m. to tell her that he had been worried that Lynette hadn't come back home yet. At around 1 to 2 a.m, Darren took a walk around the block to see if he could find her, but he was unable to, and he ended up spending the rest of that Sunday Sunday night into Monday morning, waiting for Lynette to come back home. That Monday morning, the father of Lynette's youngest child arrived at Charlotte's home, and when he learns that Lynette hadn't yet come home, he waited around all day with Darren, hoping that she would show up. By the time the clock struck 5 p.m. that evening, Darren and the father of Lynette's youngest decided to go to the liquor store to see if anybody knew where Lynette might have been. But when they asked, nobody had seen Lynette since 9:30 p.m. the night before. It was at that point that the father of Lynette's youngest took his son to his grandmother's house. The investigators had been interested in the goings-ons at this liquor store, and so they decided to pay a visit on the 29th of September. They asked the owner if they could watch the CCTV tape of the night that Lynette went missing, but the owner told them that the tape of September 20th had already been recorded over. And so the detectives decided to go speak to Bob Olson, who had been the clerk that had been working the night that Lynette went missing. Bob told them that Lynette had come to the store 3 times that night and had made 3 phone calls, and that on her last trip to the store at about 9:30 p.m, she told Bob that she'd be back at 11 p.m. to talk to him. However, Lynette didn't show up, and so he and the stock clerk left the liquor store at 11:07 p.m. The detectives found it to have been suspicious that a 25-year-old woman would be meeting up with Bob, who'd been twice Lynette's age, so late at night. Quote, "I didn't think at the time he was being totally honest." The detectives would later learn during a subsequent interview with Lucy, Lynette's cousin, that there had been no phone at Charlotte's home, and so they would often use the payphone at the liquor store, that they would shop there for items other than alcohol, and that Lynette had worked out a deal with the night clerk, Bob Olson, in which Bob would pay Lynette money so that he could touch her. Victim 4. Friday the 23rd of October 1998 at about 10 p.m. A phone call is connected to the emergency services in which it is reported that there had been a woman's body floating in the California aqueduct in Hesperia. This call came in just a month after Tina Renee Gibbs's body had been dumped in the same aqueduct some 385 miles to the north. Detective Frank Gonzalez arrived at the pumping station on Amargosa Road, which was just west of Interstate 15, at about 11:20 p.m. that evening. Detective Gonzalez awaited the arrival of the rest of his team, who then set up lighting that would illuminate the area. They were then able to collect evidence and photograph the death scene, looking for any signs of tire tracks, shoe prints, or any other evidence that could have been left by the killer or killers. Detective Gonzalez maneuvered himself down the embankments where he could see the victim's naked body caught in one of the gates underneath the pumping station. It had been discovered by 2 guards. Due to the fact that the victim had been naked, Detective Gonzalez made an initial presumption that the victim had been murdered during a sexual assault. Interestingly, when the detective got closer to the victim, he was shocked to see that the victim's chest had a circular indentation where the victim's left breast used to be. It was at that point when Detective Gonzalez knew that this death had not just been a personal one, but one that had been violent. It wasn't long after this discovery that the sheriff's dive team arrived to recover the victim's body. After doing so, the dive team dived to the bottom of the aqueduct to see if they could find any more evidence, but their searches were fruitless. Meanwhile, Detective Gonzalez took a closer look at the victim's body and was able to establish that there had been a scar on her stomach and ligature marks on her wrists and ankles, indicative of the fact that she had been bound. The coroner's investigator then took the victim's fingerprints before placing her into a body bag to be transported for an autopsy. These fingerprints were entered into the California ID system later that same night, and within hours they had a massive lead. A match. The victim had been 29-year-old Patricia Ann Tamers. Patricia Ann Tamers had been born on the 25th of April 1969 in McAllen, Texas, to parents Rodolfo and Anna Tamers. When Patricia Anna Tamers had been 2, her parents had gotten a divorce, which saw her dad Rodolfo take her from Rio Grande Valley to Santa Barbara. Rodolfo and Patricia would move again to Ventura, then to Berkeley, which had been where she had gone to high school. Patricia was described by those who knew her as a normal child who enjoyed playing with her dolls, riding her bike, and the likes. She'd kept several pets, including rabbits and a parakeet, and had given the parakeet a funeral after it had died. Patricia had been an average student at school, though she had been able to meet any intellectual challenges if she had set her mind to it. Rodolfo would later describe how he'd always remember the day when a 4-year-old Patricia had been waiting for him to get home so that she could tell him that she'd thrown away all of her baby bottles as, according to Patricia, she was a big girl now and could drink from a glass. When Patricia had been 8 years old, her father Rodolfo remarried and would go on to have 2 children with his new wife. Notably, Patricia would get on well with her step-siblings. As a teenager, Patricia loved to cook food and was described as having a weakness for fast food. It was her guilty pleasure. And tragically, it had been this love of food and her dysmorphic view of her own body that saw her trying different diet pills in order to lose weight. And these diet pills had been her gateway to harder substances. When Patricia had been 19 years old in 1988, she had gotten married to a man with the surname Prine. And 2 years later, in July of 1990, Patricia was arrested for the first time in Lake County on the charges of possession of drugs and hypodermic needles. It had been her father, Rodolfo, that had bailed her out of jail, and Patricia explained that she had taken the fall for her husband, who she described as being a drug addict, as she had no criminal record. As a result of this arrest, Patricia was sent to a diversion program, after which she filed for divorce and moved back in with her father Rodolfo in Hesperia. It appeared that Patricia was trying to get her life back on track, especially when she enrolled at a community college in Victorville, something which her father had been proud of her for. On all accounts, Patricia had done well in community college and had hoped to go on to become an X-ray technician, though when she applied to a vocational program for it, she was rejected as she hadn't taken human anatomy. Patricia took this setback to heart drastically, and instead of enrolling in an anatomy class to tick that checkbox, she spiraled. Patricia thought herself to have been so unlucky and that nothing ever went right by her. By the time the new year of 1993 came around, Patricia had quit community college and had fallen back into trouble again. You see, Patricia had started a relationship with a man by the name of James, who had been heavily involved with drugs, and they were both arrested. James was arrested and charged with felony possession of pseudoephedrine, which is the main ingredient of methamphetamine, with the intent to manufacture methamphetamine. He was also charged with the count of selling or transporting methamphetamine. Patricia, on the other hand, was charged with possession for sale of methamphetamine. This didn't scare Patricia away from the world of drugs, as just 10 weeks later, they were arrested again. This time, both Patricia and James were arrested and charged with possession with intent to manufacture methamphetamine. Rodolfo felt he had to step in and got Patricia an attorney who, through a plea bargain, managed to bring the charges down. Patricia was ultimately sentenced to 190 days in jail, but would go on to be released on her own recognizance on the promise that she'd go to rehab. It's interesting to note that at the time, Patricia had told her probation officer that she had been using drugs since the age of 13 and had been $30,000 in debt. On the 26th of May 1993, Patricia entered an inpatient rehabilitation facility and only stayed for 2 months, which had been just long enough to satisfy the court's requirements of going to rehab, despite the fact that she could have stayed for a full year. In July of 1993, her sentence was suspended and she received 3 years probation, which was actually revoked after she tested positive for methamphetamine 7 times in early 1994. Subsequently, Patricia was ordered to go to jail for a year, though somehow she avoided jail time and ended up back in rehab instead of in jail. Patricia ended up completing a 15-hour parenting program from the Chaffee Adult School in Substance Abuse on the 18th of May 1994, as she had actually been pregnant at the time. In 1995, Patricia gave birth to a baby girl, and it appeared that Patricia had started doing better. She'd been living in low-income housing in Barstow with the father of her baby, and Rodolfo thought Patricia to have been a good mother. This all came crashing down, however, when the baby had been 18 months old, and Patricia had what was described as a psychotic break. It's thought that this psychotic break was brought on by the meth use, which can cause schizophrenic-like symptoms like hallucinations and delusional thinking. The psychotic break started when Patricia had called the police and claims that somebody had broken into her house and moved her knife that had been left out on the countertop. The police would ultimately pick up Patricia on a 5150, which is a term used when the police deem somebody to be a danger to themselves or others, and place the 18-month baby into protective custody. Rodolfo would be granted custody of the baby, with Patricia often visiting her daughter. Patricia would spend 60 days at the MFI Recovery Center in Riverside, but unfortunately it didn't work. And Rodolfo grew more and more distressed that the drugs were destroying Patricia's mind. When she was sober, she was capable of having an intelligent discussion. When she was high, she would ramble and be irrational. As the year progressed, Rodolfo saw Patricia less and less, and she chose to stay with friends instead of stay at his house. Patricia would tell Rodolfo that she wasn't like other addicts, that she'd met in rehab who'd had horrible childhood experiences that had pushed them into drugs. But to Rodolfo, this was clear evidence that addiction can devastate any family. Quote, "You know, Dad, I don't ever want you to blame yourself for any bad decisions I might have made. You're the best father any daughter could have ever wanted." Rodolfo responded to his daughter, quote, "We'll fight this demon. We'll beat it." It had been in October of 1996 that Patricia would be arrested once more, though this time for attempted grand theft of items worth $400 to $1,000 at St. Mary's Hospital in Apple Valley. She had been confronted by hospital staff after a brief struggle with security. She was then handcuffed and detained. Patricia had stopped reporting to her probation officer in mid-June, though there is no record of any charges being filed in that hospital theft case. It was immediately clear that Patricia's mental state had been disintegrating and getting far worse. It had been on the 20th of January 1997 that Patricia had been arrested in Victorville for commercial burglary, which saw her going to jail until the 7th of February. Patricia would be arrested once more on the 6th of March, but this time for sending a false bomb, stalking and making terrorist threats at the Army Armory in Victorville. She'd once again be released on her own recognizance until sentencing. And in June, she was arrested for petty theft from a retail store. It had been during this arrest that somebody finally noticed Patricia's mental state had been erratic. The court therefore ordered Patricia to undergo psychological evaluation before any prosecution could occur. The evaluation was carried out by forensic psychologist Robert L. Suter, with the report being dated for the 7th of August. It is this report that details the only written account of Patricia's version of events, her reality. Let's take a look at what she said. Patricia said in this report that she had left high school after finishing the 11th grade, completing her degree in 1995 through adult education. She then said that her marriage had ended when her husband had been charged with, quote, throwing people off cliffs in carpets. It's important to note that she refused to elaborate any further on that. After divorcing her husband, Patricia explains that she had spent the next 2 years attending classes at 2 community colleges, though she hadn't completed her course and subsequently didn't earn her degree. After that, Patricia said that she, quote, floated around and lived with a man who she would go on to have a baby with. The baby was now living with her mother. Patricia told the psychologist that she had only had one job, which had been a 6-month stint at a college library. Quote, Patricia survived financially by begging. She stated she is at times homeless and in certain instances, she sleeps in a sleeping bag under a bush. According to the report, Patricia had a difficult time filling out the fairly straightforward and simple intake form, and she demonstrated, quote, overt paranoia and delusional thought processes. It appeared to the psychologist that Patricia didn't appear to have understood the court system or the roles of the prosecutor or even her attorney, and it was as a result of this evaluation and a handful of other factors that the psychologist subsequently diagnosed Patricia with a non-specific psychotic disorder with schizoid traits. The psychologist found Patricia to be incompetent, quote, to assist her own defense in a rational manner, before recommending that she be sent to Patton State Hospital in San Bernardino, quote, for a period of observation and treatment. Patricia underwent inpatient treatment at Patton State Hospital for about 6 weeks after being admitted on the 21st of November, before she was deemed competent enough to face the charges that had been brought against her. Quote, it is critical that Ms. Tamers continue taking the prescribed medication while in custody in order to ensure continued competency. Patricia then agreed to another plea deal in February of 1998, in which she pleaded guilty to making terrorist threats in exchange for 3 years of probation, going to rehab and no jail time. Quote, Ms. Tamers feels that she is in dire need of rehabilitation as well as psychological treatment. She is currently scheduled to enter a sober living rehabilitation program and hopes to be a resident of that program for approximately 8 months. Quote, I just want to turn my life around. I know it's never too late. I want to work on my recovery, get a place of my own, and become a good citizen. Patricia would then meet with her probation officer, who noted that she already had 409 days of, quote, custody credits, and who reiterated that violations of her probation could result in state prison time. Sadly, a few days after that meeting, Patricia was actually turned away from the Gibson House for Women in San Bernardino, which is a treatment facility tailored specifically for women who were struggling with addiction, as she had been intoxicated. It seems that after being rejected from the sober living program, Patricia's case fell through the cracks of the system, and she tragically ended up back on the streets. Quote, you know, you get to the point where when you've got this type of addiction, you have nothing left to sell. You sell your body. It was the addiction that, you know, put her there, which was a quote from her father, Rodolfo. Rodolfo would always remember the last time that he saw his daughter Patricia, a memory he'd replay in his mind over and over and over again. You see, Rodolfo had gone to a friend's house to use the internet, and Patricia had been there. He took the opportunity to remind her that, quote, life is short, don't waste it, do something with your life. According to Rodolfo, Patricia seemed to have been rational, lucid, and clear-headed that day. She handed Rodolfo a red ribbon that said, quote, "Drugs destroy dreams," while telling him that she wanted him to have it. When Patricia was getting ready to leave, Rodolfo offered to take her for a hamburger, but he unfortunately ended up having to stay at his friend's house as he had to deal with some kind of a computer problem. Rodolfo said to Patricia, quote, "Okay, mijija, take care." Mijija meaning my daughter in Spanish, also excuse my Spanish pronunciation. Rodolfo had said it several times to Patricia, and he wished deep down that he could give her something more helpful, but it had been the best that he could do. Patricia had worked the streets on the southeast corner of 6th and D Street in Victorville 3 to 5 days a week, and a man called Larry would work across the street and would often see her out of his office window. Larry would see Patricia soliciting dates and getting into cars with men before returning a little while later to work more, and Patricia would actually go into Larry's office to ask for food, water, or cigarettes, which he would try to give to her. It'd been on the 22nd of October between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. in the afternoon when Larry had seen a black 18-wheeler with white writing on the driver's side pull up to the corner and block his view of Patricia. As the truck had been making a right-hand turn to head east on Highway 18, which was also called D Street, he saw Patricia close the door and pull her jacket through the window. That would be the last time he ever saw Patricia. Larry would later tell the authorities that the driver had been a white man in his mid-30s with dark hair and what looked to have been several days' worth of beard growth. The next day, Patricia would be found dead in the California Aqueduct, 8 miles to the south of Victorville. On Saturday, the 25th of October, 1998, in the late morning, Detective Gonzalez and another detective went to Rodolfo's house in Hesperia to carry out the official notification of Patricia's death. It had been Detective Gonzalez who had led the conversation, first asking Rodolfo if he had been Patricia's father, to which he said that he was, then asking for some ID. Rodolfo had initially thought the detectives had been there to tell him that his daughter Patricia had been arrested again, though it slowly dawned on him that the police don't show up at your house to tell you that. Something else had been very wrong. The detectives asked Rodolfo when the last time had been when he had seen Patricia, to which he told them that he had last seen her about a week ago. It was then that the detectives told Rodolfo what had happened to his only daughter, Patricia, including the facts that her breast had been removed. Rodolfo would later describe that he felt a pain so great that he couldn't cry until the detectives had been about to leave, and from that day on, he was haunted by the thoughts that Patricia might have been alive when she was discarded in the aqueduct. After the official notification had taken place, Detective Gonzalez returned to the aqueduct to take a look at the death scene with fresh eyes, but he found nothing new. The following day, on Sunday the 25th of October, the detectives returned with the sheriff's search and rescue team in order to conduct an expanded search. Due to the fact that the area had been wide open and in plain view of cars that passed by on Amagosa Road, Detective Gonzalez determined that Patricia must have been dumped somewhere upstream and then had floated down the aqueduct. He then set to work in establishing a potential dump site, tracing the aqueduct west a few miles until he found somewhere promising, a dirt turnout next to a bridge where the aqueduct crossed Interstate 395, which was about a mile from Interstate 15. The autopsy on Patricia's remains had taken place on Wednesday the 28th of October 1998 and was carried out by Dr. Stephen Trenkle, a pathologist and medical examiner for San Bernardino County. The pathologist took swabs from the remains for a sex kit to be completed, and he made note of the fact that Patricia had hemorrhaging in the whites of her eyes and pinpoint hemorrhages on her face and upper lip. These had both been factors indicative of strangulation. Patricia also had pale marks around her wrists and ankles, which implied that she had been bound. The pathologist then uncovered that only the right ankle showed any signs of hemorrhaging, which meant that the other binds were likely tied while her heart was barely beating, if at all. It was then noted that Patricia had a 6 by 6 inch sized hole in the deepest layer of fat over the chest wall muscle, which had been where her left breast had been cut away, apparently using some kind of sawing motion and a fairly sharp instrument. Now, Dr. Stephen Trenkle had been unable to determine whether or not Patricia had been alive or dead when her breast had been removed, due to the fact that the area had very little blood flow, and if there had been any bleeding, it would have been washed away while Patricia had been in the aqueduct's water. A second pathologist by the name of Dr. Yeager would examine Patricia's breast later on and determines that it had most likely been severed post-mortem. Patricia's brain had been found to have been swollen during the autopsy, which occurs when the brain is deprived of oxygen, blood, or glucose, and this is indicative of strangulation. The pathologist noted that the most significant injury that indicated the strangulation to have been in the neck. There had been no fracture in the the neck, but bleeding was found on the right side around the thyroid cartilage, which is where the Adam's apple protects the vocal cords. Now, Dr. Stephen Trenkle would then proceed to cut open Patricia's back, something that he would later state he didn't always do during an autopsy. It had been after doing so that he discovered a significant amount of bleeding in the center of Patricia's spine, and the fact that her back had been broken. This injury was determined to have been inflicted while Patricia was still alive, and it would have rendered her paralyzed from the mid-chest down. Dr. Stephen Trenkle waited almost 2 months for the results of the toxicology tests and microscopic examination of tissues to come back before declaring the official cause of death. The official cause of death was determined to have been strangulation, most likely by the killer's hands and not by a ligature. The pathologist stated that Patricia had been dead before she was thrown into the water of the aqueduct. It was noted that the toxicology screening shows that Patricia's liver had been inflamed, which was often seen in people who have taken prescription drugs or abused street drugs, but the tox screening detected no traces of any drugs, albeit illicit or prescription, in her blood. Patricia had been sober. The detectives were at a loss for who was responsible for the brutal murder of Patricia. At least, that was until the following month, when a drastic turn of events occurred that uncovered the truth behind not just the murder of Patricia Ann Tamers, but also Lynette Dayon White, Tina Renee Gibbs, and the Jane Doe known as Torso Girl. It had been at about 7 p.m. on Monday, the 2nd of November 1998, when a man by the name of Wayne Adam Ford had phoned up his older brother Rodney Ford and told him, quote, "I'm in some real bad trouble and I think the police are looking for me. I need your help." Rodney immediately knew that something had been seriously wrong with his younger brother, and without a second thought made the 5-hour-long drive to Ocean Grove Lodge, which was a motel in Trinidad, California, Trinidad being located about half an hour to the north of the town of Eureka, which had been where Rodney and Wayne Adam Ford had both grown up. Rodney arrived at the motel at about 1 a.m. and went straight into the cabin in which Wayne had been staying, and when he saw his younger brother Wayne, he noted just how bad he looked, describing him as being unkempt and emotionally ragged with messy hair and red eyes that told Rodney he had been crying when Rodney had arrived. Wayne gave Rodney a big hug before they both went into the motel cabin and spoke for nearly 2 hours. Rodney found it particularly difficult to follow along with what Wayne had been saying to him as he cried and he rambled to Rodney, jumping from one topic to another. Rodney would later describe Wayne as talking nonsense. After almost 2 hours of Wayne talking this nonsense to his brother, who had driven the long 5-hour drive to see him, he became more serious and told Rodney, quote, "I hurt some people, and I don't want to hurt anybody anymore." Though, when Rodney asked him to elaborate, Wayne refused. He just reiterated that he wanted to get help as he didn't want to hurt people anymore. Quote, "I want to go to the sheriff's, I want to turn myself in." It was at that point that Rodney told Wayne that he had been exhausted from having travelled so far, telling him, quote, "Let's just go to sleep. We'll wake up in the morning, go get some breakfast and work this out." The brothers awoke on Tuesday the 3rd of November 1998 at around 7:30 a.m, with Rodney suggesting that they both get showered and get cleaned up before going on to get something to eat. They went out to get breakfast at the Denny's located just off the highway in Eureka, and it had been at breakfast that Rodney decided that he would try again to find out the particulars of what was going on with his younger brother. When Rodney brought up the subject of who exactly Wayne had hurt, Wayne shut him down, saying, quote, "I don't want to talk about that right now. I just want to spend the day with you. Let's go and look at the apartments where we lived as kids." And that is exactly what they did. They travelled over to the apartments in which they lived in as kids. After that, they went to a few different nostalgic locations around the city. Now, according to Rodney, 1 minute Wayne would appear to be fine and in good spirits, and in the next minute he would break down crying. And Rodney's concern and worry for his younger brother only grew as he started to think about what Wayne hadn't told him. Quote, "How did you hurt some people?" Rodney asked Wayne. "If I tell you, you won't love me. You'll hate me. I love you. I'm your brother. I hurt some people bad, and they don't have to worry about anything anymore." Rodney was understandably extremely concerned when he heard Wayne say that last sentence. Rodney and Wayne quickly came to an agreement that Rodney shouldn't be placed in a position where he could get into trouble for whatever Wayne had done. Though Rodney knew that as he knew that Wayne had hurt some people, he couldn't let Wayne just walk away, especially if he could be seen as an accomplice after the fact if he did. Rodney's concern as to who exactly Wayne had hurt began to expedite after Wayne continuously previously spoke about how, quote, screwed up his life was, and of how he was never going to see his son. You see, Wayne had actually tried to kill himself a couple of years earlier after divorcing his ex-wife, and at that point he had spoken about killing his ex-wife too, though Wayne reassured Rodney that both his ex-wife and his son were okay. But he did refuse to say much more besides the fact that he wanted to turn himself in. It did, though, appear as if Wayne was actually avoiding going to the sheriff's office. Quote, once he gave himself up, he said he knew he wouldn't see Rodney anymore because he was never going to get out of jail. The only one who could forgive him was God. Quote, I don't want to live anymore. I don't want to live with myself. I deserve to die. As noon became late afternoon, Wayne suggested that he and Rodney go to the cinema together to watch a movie, once more avoiding doing what Wayne had said he wanted to do, turn himself in. 15 minutes into the movie, Rodney had enough. He leaned over to Wayne and said, quote, we need to go to the sheriff's. It's getting late. Wayne replied to Rodney, quote, I don't want to go now. Rodney got the impression that Wayne meant he didn't want to go right now at that moment, and so replied with, quote, well, we're going. Rodney led Wayne out of the movie theatre before driving them over to their grandmother's house, which was located just a few blocks away from the courthouse where the sheriff's department was. Rodney thought that Wayne might need a calm and relaxing walk before turning himself in. When they had been about 10 minutes away from the sheriff's department, Wayne started to change his mind. Quote, I don't want to go now. Rodney got the impression that Wayne meant that he now didn't want to go at all anymore. Wayne told Rodney that he was worried that once he went in there, he would never come out again. It was at this point that Rodney told his younger brother that he'd call up the FBI or whoever he needed to in order to make it easier for Wayne to feel better and more confident about turning himself in. It's interesting to note that Rodney did actually make a call on his cell phone at around 6 p.m. to an 800 number, which he thought to have been the number for the San Francisco FBI field office. Rodney left a voice message on this number, which comforted Wayne enough to go into the sheriff's office. What the brothers didn't know had been that the phone number had been for a private company called Federal Prison Industries, and not the FBI. Once Rodney and Wayne had entered the sheriff's office, Rodney had been the one to pick up the wall phone and speak with the receptionist. He told the receptionist that they needed to see the sheriff as his younger brother Wayne wanted to turn himself in. When Rodney was asked why, he explained, quote, he said he wanted to hurt some people and he wants to be off the streets. The receptionist obtained Wayne's full legal name and date of birth, which they ran through the system, but no results were returned and no flags were raised. The receptionist then asked Rodney if they could speak directly with Wayne, and when Wayne was handed the wall phone, he told the receptionist the same thing that Rodney had. The receptionist asked Wayne if he had any weapons on him, to which he said that he didn't, before he was asked to take a seat and was informed that somebody would be out shortly to speak with him. As the brothers waited for someone to come out and speak with them, Wayne told Rodney that he'd decided he wanted to leave, but Rodney told him that he wasn't going anywhere. After waiting for about 20 minutes, Deputy Michael Gainey came out to speak to them. He approached the brothers and asked Wayne why exactly he had been turning himself in, to which Wayne repeated that he'd hurt a lot of people. The deputy told him that they needed to take it one step at a time and that he needed some basic information first, such as where Wayne had lived and what he'd done exactly. Wayne told the deputy that he didn't want to hurt anyone anymore, and it was at this point that Sergeant Michael Thomas joined the group and noted Wayne to have appeared to be anxious and unsettled. The sergeant and deputy explained again to Wayne that they needed more information, which prompted Wayne to motion to one of the front pockets of his jacket and say, quote, once you see what I have in my pocket, you'll know. It's just the tip of the iceberg. Alarm bells set off the two officers as to what exactly had been in Wayne's pockets. Could it be a weapon of some kind? When they asked Wayne, he failed to actually respond to them. Sergeant Michael Thomas then asked Wayne whether he could look inside the pocket, which prompted Wayne to reach for the pocket. The sergeant immediately stopped Wayne and told him that they'd go into his pocket for safety purposes. The sergeant and the deputy asked Wayne if there'd been anything in his pocket that might hurt them if they reached in to take it out, and Wayne reassured them that it hadn't been anything like that. And so the sergeant reached down and lifted the external flap of Wayne's pocket as the deputy pulled it away from Wayne's chest. When they peered inside, they could see what appeared to have been a Ziploc sandwich bag. Both of the officers then decided to put on a pair of latex gloves before proceeding. The deputy then pulled out the pocket again while Sergeant Michael Thomas reached in to grab the Ziploc bag. Wayne looked down at the ground as the sergeant examined the Ziploc bag. It appeared to have contained something fleshy, and it had been leaking fluid into his palm. Sergeant Michael Thomas immediately recognized what he had been looking at. It had been some fatty yellow tissue with a brown nipple. It was a human female breast. They pulled out a human breast from Wayne's pockets, and when they pulled it out, it was at that point that Wayne told the officers, quote, things are so screwed up in my head now, I just want help. The officers then asked Wayne to stand up, which he complied with, before asking through floods of tears whether he could hug his older brother Rodney, which the officers agreed to let him do. The two brothers cried as they hugged. The officers then asked Wayne to turn around before placing him into handcuffs and walking him out of the lobby across the street to the jail. Rodney was asked by Sergeant Michael Thomas to stick around in the lobby so they could ask him some more questions. And both officers would later testify that Wayne had been arrested on suspicion of aggravated mayhem, the unlawful removal of a human part. What they hadn't let Wayne or Rodney know was that as soon as they saw the human breast, they had immediately linked it to the case of Patricia and Tamers. The detectives now had to find the answers to all the questions that had sprung from Wayne handing himself in. Who was Wayne? Why had he done this? And had there been any more victims? Wayne Adam Ford was born on the 3rd of December 1961 in Petaluma, Northern California, to parents Karen and Jean. He was the youngest of two born to the couple. Wayne's mother had been German and was born in January of 1942 as Karen Bridget Danziger. Karen was described as not having that nurturing gene that most mothers have, and some believe this was on part due to the rocky relationship she had with her real mother. As Karen was growing up, she would move between Germany and the United States as she was traded between her grandmother and her mother. Wayne's father, on the other hand, Calvin Eugene Ford, known as just Gene, was born in March of 1938 in Missouri to parents Merle and Myrtle Ford. Gene would grow up in Northeast California, which was where his father worked in the lumber mills. When Gene was about to turn 18 years old in 1956, he and his friends decided to enlist in the army. Gene's entrance exam results had been so good, amongst the top 1%, that he was actually selected to go into intelligence work, which involved the interception of global radio signals. The year after enlisting in 1957, when Gene had been stationed at Herzog Base in Herzogenaurach, Germany, excuse my German pronunciation, it was there that he met Karen Bridget Danziger. Karen had been 16 years old when she had met Gene at a birthday party on the base shortly after she had moved back to Germany from Texas. Gene had been 4 years older than Karen and they dated for about a year and a half. They'd often sneak away to the village where Karen's grandmother lived, which Karen would later claim was due to the fact that her mother didn't approve of her relationship with Gene, though Gene would later state that he never got that impression. Karen's relationship with her mother had been rocky at the best of times, as she found her to have been overbearing. Quote, "I was wanting to kill her. I'd thought about it because I was so desperate to get away, but it didn't go very far. You know what kept me from pursuing the thought was I didn't want to go to jail." Karen's desperation to escape her mother led her to create a plan of action. She could escape her if she got married to Gene. And so Karen announced that she wanted to marry Gene one day when he had been over, to which her mother immediately shot her down and stated that there would be no such marriage. Karen retorted by declaring that she'd just have to get pregnant, then they would have to get married. When Gene would later be asked about this conversation, he would say that he didn't remember it and that it was likely that the conversation between Karen and her mother had been in German. Gene had always believed that Karen's parents had wanted them to get married. Karen would later state that it had been at this moment that she felt something snap inside of her, and so she went into the bathroom and ingested a large number of her mother's pills. Quote, "I swallowed them and went into the bathroom and lay down, waited to die, and after some time they missed me. They came in and I was already out, so they called the ambulance and took me, pumped my stomach and kept me there for 2 or 3 days." Interestingly, according to Gene, Karen hadn't stayed overnight in the hospital. According to him, the doctor had advised him to walk Karen around the family's apartment on the base for hours until the drugs had worked their way out of her system. Karen would later claim that this had been the only time that she'd attempted to end her own life. Gene, on the other hand, would later state that Karen's parents had told him that this had been her second suicide attempt, with the first attempt having happened when Gene had been back in the United States and Karen had been scared that he would not return. Now, Karen and Gene would eventually get married, and unbeknownst to the couple, Karen had actually been 2 months pregnant with Rodney when she'd gotten married. Rodney would then be born in Nuremberg on the 26th of March 1960. After the birth of Rodney, Karen claims that she would start taking birth control as she didn't want to get pregnant again. Though one weekend, Karen had been off the pill when Gene had been playing in a football game out of town. Karen had dropped Rodney off to stay with Gene's grandmother so that she could join Gene in a hotel, which is a bit wild to me. She just dropped off her child so that she could just spend the night with her husband like that. It's a bit, I could not imagine being their grandmother. Anyway, The couple then allegedly got into another argument that night about sex. Karen would later claim that Jean had raped her that night. It's important to note that Karen never spoke of this alleged rape until years later. It was after this intercourse that Karen found herself to be pregnant for a second time, this time with Wayne. After Wayne was born, and when Wayne had still been young but not too young to not understand the implications of it, Karen told him that he'd been the product of rape, and this caused immeasurable damage. When Jean would later be told of the accusation brought against him by Karen, he denied it. Now, Karen suddenly found herself at 19 years old with 2 children and with a failed relationship with her husband. She felt that she had been far too tied down to ever be able to get a divorce from Jean. Karen had also been determined to not love her new baby Wayne due to the circumstances in which he had been conceived. Though, according to Karen, Wayne had been such a good baby that she'd been unable to resent him. It's important to note, for the sake of understanding the dynamic that Wayne had with his mother, that she would later state that she had never been one to show love for her children. Allegedly, Karen had been far more focused on her own loneliness and dealing with her own mental health struggles than showing affection to her children. According to Jean, Karen would touch the boys in a not very loving way. When she changed their clothes, she would apparently be pretty rough with them. Now, it's important to establish that Jean's family had no idea that there had been marital problems going on. As Wayne and Rodney grew up, they shared a bedroom with bunk beds. They had been close as brothers. Each of the boys' relationship with their mother Karen had been different, with Wayne seemingly always trying to get his mother's approval. When Karen would count to 3, by the time she got to 1, Wayne would have already completed whatever Karen had asked him to do. Rodney, on the other hand, would wait until the very last second to make a move. When it came to Jean's parenting style, he had been more physical with them. He would sometimes punish Rodney and Wayne using a belt. According to Karen, Jean didn't punish the boys physically often, but sometimes he did hit them too hard, which would, quote, leave welts on their shoulders. Karen would apparently leave the discipline of the boys to Jean, telling them, quote, just wait till your dad gets home, as a threat for any unsavory behavior. And according to Rodney and Wayne, it had been Rodney that had taken the brunt of Jean's discipline. Although Rodney and Wayne had been close, they were still very competitive, as most brothers are with each other. Though what's very abnormal is that Wayne would later tell a psychologist that Jean would make him and Rodney put on boxing gloves and, quote, duke it out when they had disagreements or arguments. Rodney was described as being more social than Wayne was, with Rodney enjoying playing with the other neighborhood kids outside as Wayne stayed back at the house with his mother and playing in the sandbox with his toys. Rodney was described as being, quote, even-keeled, whereas Wayne was described as having emotional highs and lows, just like his mother Karen, a child that held on to his feelings and had been unable to let things go. Now, due to the fact that Jean works intelligence, he was sent all over the world on different assignments. He would sometimes spend up to a year away from Karen and their children, leaving Karen to raise the boys on her own. It had been on one of these assignments, when Jean was told that he had to go to Okinawa, that he realized that he had one more chance to make his failing marriage work. Jean sat down with Karen and discussed their future. He wanted his family to come with him to Okinawa, but Karen was very resistant. She didn't want to go. Karen was so resistant to going to Okinawa that she threatened Jean with divorce if he made her go. Allegedly, Karen claims that Jean told her he'd take the boys away from her if she left him. She would later quote Jean as saying, quote, I'll turn into an alcoholic and I'll just do away with myself. It was at this point that Karen stopped talking about leaving Jean, which made Karen, quote, miserable. She was adamant, however, that her children didn't grow up without their father. As it turned out, the entire family did in fact end up going to Okinawa for a couple of years. Rodney and Wayne attended elementary school there in the late 1960s. According to Karen, her life there had been very difficult, and she felt as if she'd been on the cusp of a nervous breakdown the entire time. She would beg Jean, quote, send me back to the States. I want to go back to the States. I can't do it anymore. Karen's mental health continued to rapidly decline, ultimately becoming so devastating to her that she felt she had no other choice but to end it. It had been Rodney, at the age of 8 years old, who had one morning come downstairs into the kitchen to find his mother Karen sitting in a pool of her own blood with wounds on her wrists. Karen had told Rodney that she'd accidentally cut herself on the lid of a can, but Rodney was clever, and even at 8 years old, he understood what his mother had done, and he didn't believe the story that she told him. Quote, I was smart enough to know it wasn't an accident. According to Rodney, the paramedics would take Karen away and to the military hospital by the time his younger brother Wayne had woken up. Many years later, a forensic psychiatrist would classify Karen's teenage incident of swallowing the pills after her mother had forbade her from marrying Jean as an act of suicidal gesture, and this this incident, this act in her kitchen, as a genuine suicide attempt. Karen would ultimately get her way. According to her, she'd get to go home after she spoke to Jean's commander about her need to go home. According to Jean, though, it had been him who had sent Karen back home after one of his men had broken down to him and told him that he'd been having an affair with her. When Karen returned to the United States, she brought the children to Eureka, California. It was there that she proceeded to have an affair with Jean's 15-year-old brother Billy, who had actually still been living with his parents, Karen's parents-in-law. A personal note, not only does this affair when she gets back to the States give credence to Jean's account that she had an affair with one of his men, which was why he'd sent her back to the States, but it's also downright disgusting. She was a grown woman having an affair with not just her husband's younger brother, but a 16-year-old. When Jean came back to the United States during a break from his assignments, Karen told him about the affair she'd had with his younger brother. Jean reacted by buying a house in Santa Rosa, which was 220 miles away from Eureka and from Billy. And after doing so, he had to go back to Okinawa to finish his assignment there. Though, not long after going back, in 1969, Jean was discharged from the army as a staff sergeant. A key event in the relationship between Karen and Jean that greatly impacted both Rodney and Wayne had occurred in the middle of the night at about 2 a.m. when both the boys had been asleep. Jean and Karen had another argument about sex, and the story of what actually happened that night is vastly different depending on whether you speak to Karen or whether you speak to Jean. The true story of what occurred is hidden somewhere between both accounts, so keep that in mind. It's also important to state that we know Karen's retelling of events to be inaccurate at the best of times, so it's difficult to know whether she's telling the truth or not. Let's take a look at what Karen recounts of that night. According to Karen, she had always kept a .38 caliber Magnum gun in the house as a means of protection, though she had always been careful to ensure that the bullets were kept in a separate location as to prevent her children from accidentally finding the weapon, playing with it, and potentially hurting themselves or others. Basic gun safety requirements. Now, Karen claims that it had been that night when Jean had gotten the gun out and allegedly said, quote, "If I can't have you, nobody is going to." A struggle then ensued with Karen trying to wrestle the gun away, but she was unsuccessful. And so Karen ran to grab the bullets that were kept separately so that she could hide them. However, Jean managed to get to the bullets first. Karen was allegedly so frightened that Jean would kill her, Rodney, and Wayne, and then himself, that she ended up fleeing next door to ask him to call for the police. And when Karen returned to the family home, she wasn't sure if the gun had been loaded. She apparently called out to Jean, quote, "Don't do this." It had been at that point that the police had pulled up to their home. Karen then allegedly told the police that she'd been divorcing Jean and that they needed to take him now. She didn't want him in the house. According to Karen, the authorities then took Jean away, and when he came back a few days later, he spoke to Karen and told her something that would forever stick with her, quote, "You won." Now, Jean's version of events of that night had been different. When he heard Karen's account of what happened, he said that it had just been another one of Karen's fantasies. Jean had apparently bought that gun for Rodney to use once he was old enough to be responsible. He confirmed that he did keep the bullets separately from the gun and implied that Karen largely had absolutely nothing to do with the firearm. Jean would state that it had been in an argument towards the end of their marriage when Karen had given the firearm to their next door neighbor and told this neighbor that she was afraid that Jean would try to hurt her or somebody else. Apparently, Jean and Karen would have sex one more time at her encouragement, but it didn't help fix any of their issues. They would talk about it over breakfast the next morning, quote, "It's not working, is it?" Karen said to Jean, quote, "No, it's not working." Quote, "How about 30 days? Is that enough time for you to clean up your affairs and leave?" "How about today?" Jean replied. According to Rodney, Karen had broken the news in the hallway that morning by telling them that his father and her were getting divorced. Both Rodney and Jean stated that the police never went to the house that day. It's unclear if Wayne remembered the events or how he felt exactly about it. What we do know was that Wayne had been a shy guy who had difficulty expressing his emotions in a positive and healthy way. Instead of dealing with emotions properly, he would throw what was described as temper tantrums, leave class, or even skip school in its entirety. Wayne was described as not understanding how to go about talking to girls. He would get put off when girls would tease him, as he was unsure whether they actually liked him or not. Karen didn't take steps to course correct Wayne's behavior. She never spoke to Wayne about why he acted in that way, and apparently she just simply had no ability to communicate with her children or really anybody about private, intimate things. Karen would show no emotion towards her children. She wouldn't hug them, or if one of them got hurt, she would simply try to talk them through it. As Rodney and Wayne became teenagers, Karen could tell tell that Jean had favored Rodney over Wayne, and Wayne had noticed that favoritism too. Jean would later state that he and Rodney had been closer in many ways due to the fact that they had been so much more alike, but he also said that he tried to pay more attention to Wayne in order to not hurt his feelings. Rodney, on the other hand, always felt that Wayne got more attention and would often call Wayne a quote mama's boy. It was clear that both Jean and Karen had difficulty balancing the attention and needs of their children, and it would seem that everything had quickly become too much for Karen. When Wayne had been 12 years old, he called up his father Jean in tears and asked his dad to come pick him up and asked him whether he could live with him. Jean told Wayne that of course he could come and live with him, and then asked him whether Wayne wanted him to come and get him. Wayne told Jean that he wanted him to go and fetch him right now. Jean asked what he meant, and Wayne replied, quote, "Well, I'm on the porch with my bag. She threw me out." Jean was quick to speak to Karen about what had happened to have caused her to throw her youngest child out of the house in such a manner, to which she told him, quote, "I just can't control him anymore. I don't want him around me." Rodney found himself forced to stay behind with his mother in order to try to ease the tensions between family members, though it wasn't long before Karen kicked him out too. Rodney had been 14 years old when he had come home one night to find the front door locked. He asked his mother to let him in, to which she said, quote, "Nope, you're not getting back in this house." Rodney would later state that Karen had told him that he was uncontrollable and that, quote, "I was just like my dad and she wasn't going to have me around anymore." Rodney, Wayne and Jean would all later state that they had always felt that Karen had abandoned her sons, though Karen would be amazed by this accusation when she was told about it, as if she had a totally different idea as to what had happened. Interestingly, Rodney didn't contact Jean after being kicked out and instead went to live with a few of the families in the neighborhood. He had only spent a couple nights each in each location before he had moved on to the next. It wasn't long before Jean had learned that his eldest child had also been kicked out and was sofa surfing, and so he decided that Rodney should come live with him too. This didn't go down well with Wayne, who started acting out as he had no longer been the sole focus of his father's attention. Jean had set the expectation that both Wayne and Rodney would have to help out with his construction projects when they came home from school, and Jean had been quite strict with the boys. If they didn't do as they were told, he would come down on them hard. Both Wayne and Rodney handled this pressure differently, with Rodney actually enjoying learning all he could while Wayne struggled. You see, Wayne found it hard to do what his father and his teachers wanted from him whilst also trying to take care of his own needs at the same time, and Jean had been at a loss as to how to best handle Wayne, so much so that he ended up approaching his friend called Keith, who he told about Wayne shutting down. Jean asked Keith whether he could speak to Wayne to see what he could do to help the situation. When Keith went to go speak with Wayne, he found him in his bedroom with his shades drawn, surrounded by his clothes, schoolbooks and papers, while rubbing his feet. Keith asked Wayne what had been going on, to which Wayne replied that his feet hurt. Quote, "When he took his socks off, his feet were covered with open sores that had become infected. He said it had been months since his last shower or even a change of socks." After some conversation, Keith asked Wayne whether he'd like to move into his house for the summer, to which Wayne agreed. Quote, "He went to work with me most days, he got stronger and things were looking good. At the end of the summer, he went back to his dad's." According to Jean, Wayne had been fine up until Jean had met a new woman, who Jean would actually go on to marry in 1976. And apparently, Wayne did not like Jean's new wife or his new sister. It's unclear how often Wayne went between his mother and father and uncle, but what we do know is at the age of 15, Wayne went off on his own to Reading. What's interesting is that Karen remembered Wayne's upbringing differently. Apparently, he had issues with some of his teachers, with one of his teachers saying that Wayne seemed to be angry and that he had been taking it out on them by being aggressive. When Karen has tried to speak to Wayne about this, he'd completely denied that there had been a problem and refused to talk about it any further. According to Karen, one day, Wayne had just come home and told her that he wanted to go live with his dad. When Karen asked why, Wayne said his dad could teach him how to fly and that they could work construction together. Apparently, Karen had thought this over for a few days before permitting Wayne to go live with Jane. A few months after doing so, Karen had allegedly received a phone call from Jean in which he was complaining about issues he had been having with Wayne. Quote, "He called me and said there was some problem with Wayne having broken into a store and there was a gun involved and he was pretty angry with Wayne. And he said, you know, he's an idiot, blah, blah, blah." Now, after that incident, Jean was apparently able to work out an informal agreement with some friends in the police department so that Wayne could wash police cruisers every day after school for 6 weeks as a punishment. Though soon after, Wayne stole a car and went joyriding, which saw his punishment extended by 4 weeks. Apparently, according to Jean, Wayne would not only wash the cruisers but also rewire them so that they didn't work properly. According to Karen, Wayne had called her to say that he wanted to go back and live with her as he had been upset with his father. Wayne claims that Jean had promised to pay him for his work, but he didn't, and so Wayne felt used. Wayne did go on to move back to live with Karen, his mother, but apparently went all downhill very quickly. He started staying out late, forcing Karen and her boyfriend at the time to drive around looking for him so that he wouldn't get caught out breaking curfew. And Wayne wouldn't tell anyone where he'd been. He grew more and more confident and defiant. One day, one of Wayne's teachers, who had been pregnant at the time, called Karen to tell her that Wayne had hit her. The teacher told Karen that she needed to get Wayne some form of counselling, with this assault seeing Wayne get a week-long suspension. Wayne refused to see a counsellor. All of this tension came to a head when Wayne grabbed Karen in the garage during an argument over his behaviour, and it had been during this incident that Karen first felt scared of her own son. Karen ended up contacting a lawyer for advice on how to manage her seemingly out-of-control son, who told Karen that so long as Wayne had been living in her home, she would be legally responsible for his actions. At some point shortly thereafter, Wayne would go to live with his uncle in Eureka. Karen would state that she doesn't remember whose idea the move had been. Wayne's uncle would remember Wayne as being a loner. He would later describe him as always being so deep in thought that he could be somewhat uncommunicative, and that Wayne would have mood swings and get very upset at times. Wayne would tell his uncle that neither of his parents loved him and that, quote, nobody cared for him at all. Wayne's uncle would actually go on to buy him a motorcycle, which Wayne ended up taking his anger out on. Quote, he'd beat it up, physically kick and beat the motorcycle because it wouldn't start. Something that stuck out to Wayne's uncle had been the fact that Wayne's relationship to punishment had been unusual. On one occasion, Wayne had decided to run away and so ran off north, though he ended up turning around once he reached Arcata. Instead of going straight back to his uncle's house, he actually went to juvenile hall. Quote, they wanted to know why he's turning himself in. He says, well, I was trying to run away, and then I had to go up and get him out of the juvenile hall and bring him home. He wanted punishment because he had the thought of running away, and he felt that he needed to be punished for that. On another occasion, Wayne's uncle and his wife had been away for several days, and when they had returned, Wayne's uncle could sense that something had not quite been right with his Camaro. Wayne, his uncle, and his aunt had all been sitting around the house when Wayne had broken into tears and confessed that he'd actually taken the car. The following day, the doorbell rang, and on the other side had been a police officer with Wayne on the doorstep. You see, the police officer had caught Wayne trying to steal a battery from another car to put in the Camaro, as he'd accidentally killed the battery in the Camaro by leaving the lights on. Quote, he couldn't handle doing something wrong and not being punished for it. He had a strong sense of justice, even today, about things. When Wayne had been age 16, Jean had called Karen to complain that he'd been upset with Wayne, at least according to Karen. Quote, we decided maybe the best thing for him would be to go into the military to get him off the streets and get some discipline. If you asked Wayne about it, he would claim that he got the idea to join the US Marines after seeing The Boys in Company C, though as he'd still been a minor, he needed parental consent. Wayne would ask his dad to sign the consent forms, and apparently Jean had been ecstatic. According to Rodney, Wayne lied about his age to the recruiters, and nobody actually noticed as he had been big for his age. Wayne had just turned 17 years old when he had entered boot camp in January of 1979, and would be the Marines that would train Wayne to become a killing machine. It had been a year after Wayne had joined the Marines, around Halloween of 1980, when Wayne had met a woman called Kelly Dick on a blind date. The blind date had been set up by one of Wayne's co-workers, and Kelly Dick, who likes the macho silent type, was instantly attracted to Wayne. Wayne had come across as standoffish and indifferent at first, going a week without calling and claiming that he had forgotten Kelly Dick's number. He'd do that only to walk the 15 miles from Marine Corps Air Station El Taro in order to see her. And this all meant that Kelly Dick couldn't quite figure him out. It kept her interested. It had been in late November while they were on their way back from dinner when Wayne and Kelly Dick saw a two-car accident take place at the side of the highway. Wayne asked Kelly Dick to stop the car so that he could check in to see if anyone had been injured. Somebody had been injured in the crash, and so Wayne told Kelly Dick to go and try and find a payphone so that they could call for an ambulance. Though when Kelly Dick returned back 20 minutes later, Wayne had been nowhere to be seen. There was an ocean of fire trucks, police cars, and rescue workers, but no Wayne. Kelly Dick asked a firefighter if they'd seen Wayne, but they said that they hadn't. They did ask Kelly Dick if she'd seen the third car, which she said that she hadn't. She presumed that this third car had been the car that she'd been in, but the firefighters told her that it hadn't been her car, it had been a red car. It wasn't until later that Kelly Dick learnt that the firefighters had been talking about a red car that a drunk driver had been operating that had swerved off the highway, hitting Wayne and another person and catapulting them almost 40 foot down the embankment. Kelly Dick would end up driving around until 3 a.m. looking for Wayne, even tracing the route he would have taken if he'd walked back to the base. It hadn't been until the following morning when she'd been talking to a friend when one of her roommates called her to say that Tustin Community Hospital had phoned to say that Wayne had been in the hospital. When Kelly Dick visited Wayne in the hospital, she saw that he looked as if he had landed right on his face, which had swollen to twice its normal size. Wayne's face had been black and blue around the eyes, most of his lip had been ripped off, which required stitches to be fixed. His front 4 teeth had been shattered, his jaw broken, but he had been remain conscious. When Kelly Dick visited Wayne again the following morning, Wayne's mother Karen had been at his bedside. You see, Karen had been living in Santa Rosa when she'd received a phone call from an ICU nurse, quote, "We have your son here, and if you can come, it would be a good idea because he's been in a serious accident. He has serious head damage." Wayne had been conscious when his mother had arrived. Karen would only stay for a couple of days, ultimately leaving Kelly Dick to look after Wayne for the remainder of his 9-day stay. Rodney would later say that Karen had called him and told him, quote, "You need to come and see your brother. I don't know if he's going to make it." It's interesting to note that both Rodney and Karen would later state that neither of them felt the need to go to the hospital and spend much time there, as Wayne's commanding officer had told Jean that Wayne's injuries hadn't been that serious and that he knocked out a couple of his teeth, and that was about it. According to them, neither of them actually knew just how severe Wayne's injuries had been until much later on. When Wayne would later speak about this incident, he would tell a psychologist that he'd been pressing his hand against the wounded driver's neck to stop the bleeding when he was thrown down the embankment. Quote, "Yeah, they revived me. I woke up 3 days later. The whole one side of my body just didn't work very good and my head was all swollen up, and it was a pretty tough time." Due to the severity of his injuries, Wayne was not able to go back to work right away. And as Kelly Dick's roommates had gone home for the holidays, she offered to let Wayne stay with her so that she could nurse him back to health. Over the course of the next week or so, the couple grew closer and closer, and once he felt better, they flew to Northern California to visit Wayne's mother Karen, Rodney, and a few other relatives. Kelly Dick and Wayne would then drive back in a 1953 Chevy that he'd bought from Rodney. Kelly Dick had noticed at the time that there had been a change in Wayne's behavior following the accident, though to her, he seemed to be more friendly and he seemed to pay her more attention. As February of the following year came around, Wayne had returned to work and he was ordered to undergo a couple of months training in Alabama. Wayne spoke to Kelly Dick about this, and then he told her that if they were to get married, then he'd be able to get a bigger salary. And so they decided that they would quietly get married. The couple decided that they would get hitched now, and so in the May, Kelly Dick and Wayne silently got married in Las Vegas. Though the couple's plan to keep it quiet fell through when Kelly Dick's sister found out about it and told Kelly Dick's mother. About 2 weeks into the new marriage, Kelly Dick began to notice another change in Wayne's behavior. You see, Kelly Dick and Wayne had been talking over some wine when Kelly had asked him about what his family had been like and what it was like for him growing up. And it was from that conversation that Kelly Dick got the feeling that Wayne hadn't been treated well in his childhood. Though when she pressed for more information, Wayne clammed up and made it clear he didn't want to talk about it. And when Kelly didn't stop pushing, Wayne got physical. Quote, "He wasn't actually aiming for me, he was just trying to swing at me to tell me to shut up, and he ended up hitting a stud in the wall and broke the knuckles in his right hand. It just shattered all the knuckles. So he ended up going to Alabama with a cast on his hand." It became clear that something had changed in Wayne's personality after the wedding, being described as becoming more, quote, demanding and domineering. It also became clear that his attitude towards his new wife Kelly had changed too, and not for the better. Wayne had moved to Alabama to undergo his training, and while he had been there, he had called Kelly and ranted to her that the money that she'd sent to him hadn't arrived in time. Kelly had then been upset to learn that Wayne had pawned his wedding ring in order to go out and drink beer with his friends. It's unclear if it had been at this same point, but around this same time, Kelly had discovered that she had been pregnant with Wayne's child. And when she told Wayne, he was very upset. He traveled back home to speak to Kelly. Quote, "He basically told me that he wasn't about to have kids right now, and I had to have an abortion. I told him I didn't want to have an abortion, and he said, well, I'm leaving then. And I felt like I had no choice." Despite Kelly's objections, she was made to go to an abortion clinic, and it was there that she was asked by a member of staff if anybody had been forcing her to undergo the procedure. She was informed that if she says somebody was forcing her, then they wouldn't be able to proceed. And it was at that point that she walked out of the interview room, past Wayne, who'd been waiting in the waiting room, and into the hall where she burst into tears. Wayne followed Kelly into the hall and asked her what happened. She told him that she didn't want to go through with this. It was then that Wayne grabbed Kelly by the arms and shoved her back towards the waiting room, saying, quote, "Get back in there." Kelly Dick would proceed with the abortion, and afterwards Wayne became allegedly abusive towards her, telling her that the only reason he married her, quote, was for a steady piece of ass. Wayne's relationship with sex was messed up, to put it lightly. He started having sex at the age of 15 and had slept with 8 women before Kelly, most of those women having what he would later describe to be large breasts. And Wayne had a very weird relationship with consent, and by that I mean that he didn't have a relationship with it. Whenever Kelly didn't want to have sex, he wouldn't take no for an answer and kept on at Kelly for hours and hours until she, quote, gave in, apparently keeping on at Kelly until 4 a.m. before she would relent. And after a while, even giving in to Wayne started to not be enough. Quote, "It was like my whole life at home had to do with sex. If I was a nymphomaniac, it might have been a great situation for me, but I'm personally not that sexually motivated." Wayne would make Kelly be naked around the house. Quote, "If Kelly Dick sat to watch TV, he would feel free to come up and start sucking on her breast. I mean, it was just a constant barrage of this. Like, that's all I was there for, that I was an object for his pleasure. Whenever the couple went out together, Wayne would make Kelly wear shirts that had been so see-through that she might have well not been wearing one at all. And this sexual torment would get so bad for Kelly that she would start crying at her desk at 5 p.m. at the end of the workday as she knew she had to go home to it. And at home, Wayne expected Kelly to cook elaborate 3-course dinners in the nude. Wayne wouldn't accept any plain vegetables in his meals, and they all had to be drenched in cheese sauce. Kelly Dick would go home for the summer as she had school, then they would go ahead and have a proper wedding in the fall. In January of 1982, Wayne had decided to go on a trip to Big Bear with some of his friends from the Marines. He'd asked Kelly if she could go, but she couldn't, and so he had gone without her. 2 days after Wayne had left, one of his friends had called up Kelly. This friend asked her if Wayne had called her, to which Kelly said that he hadn't, before the friend told her that if he did call her, tell him to come back. Naturally, Kelly wanted to know what the hell was going on, but the friend said that he couldn't tell her and just reiterated that if Wayne called, tell him to go back. Now, when Kelly had received this call, she'd been playing cribbage with a friend of hers who had been gay, and when he overheard this conversation, this friend had been so scared that he fled the apartment just in case Wayne showed up. It wouldn't be until around 11 p.m. when Wayne would finally call Kelly, and he told her a story that simply left her amazed. Amazed that Wayne believed he'd done absolutely nothing wrong, and amazed that he hadn't been the slightest bit embarrassed to tell her what he'd done. Wayne told Kelly that he and his friends had been roller skating when they'd met 2 young girls, who they'd invited over to the cabin the next day. Wayne explained to Kelly that they had slipped off their wedding rings and engaged in oral sex with the girls, who turned out to have been 15 years old. After they had finished, Wayne's friend tried to take the girls home when they had stopped to help a young guy whose car had broken down. And as it turned out, that young guy had been the boyfriend of the 15-year-old girl that Wayne had been with. This 15-year-old girl immediately jumped out of the car and screamed that she'd been raped, according to Wayne. By the time the police had gone to the men's cabin, Wayne had ran out of the back door. He'd run 10 or 15 miles before he came across a payphone, which he then used to call Kelly. Now, it's important to note that Wayne was eventually arrested for attempted rape. An arraignment date was set, but it kept on getting postponed. Kelly would later describe how this judicial process went on for 6 to 8 months. And interestingly, Wayne's record says only this about the case, quote, "Victim unavailable, decline prosecution," and whatever records there may have been about it no longer publicly exist. In April of that same year, 1982, Wayne and Kelly had both moved to Santa Ana, which was where Wayne had landed a job managing their new apartment complex, and Kelly had got a job working in a warehouse with about 30 men. It had been at this point that Wayne had changed his mind about what Kelly should wear out of the house, and he made her wear baggy clothes when she left for work. It had also been at this point when Wayne had started to get Kelly to agree to bondage during sex. When the couple had visited Hollywood, they had stopped at a sex shop where Wayne had bought a deck of cards which depicted women in various positions, though the cards focused on the breasts, which had been wrapped up or tied up. Wayne had gotten the idea that Kelly should imitate these poses during sex, making her dip her breasts in wax so that he could make molds of them. Wayne had even told Kelly that he wanted to cut holes in her sheets, then cover her up so that only her breasts were exposed. A lot more of this kinky activity went on, some a lot more extreme that I won't discuss in this coverage just out of respect for Kelly, but what I will state is Kelly had not been into this kinky activity. On the 13th of January 1983, Kelly had been ironing when everything came to a head for her. She told Wayne that she wanted to get a divorce, and unnervingly, Wayne didn't seem to be that angry with that. Wayne asked her if she would mind staying living with him until he found somebody else, and Kelly tried to suppress the fear that had come on by this calmness that was just coming from Wayne. She told Wayne that it wouldn't work well if she stayed, and so the couple discussed splitting up the furniture, the car, and their 2 motorcycles. Wayne's calmness had remained up until the point when Kelly told him that she wanted to keep her bike. Wayne asked her why, to which Kelly said that she had friends that ride, and it was at that point that Wayne exploded, dragging Kelly to the phone and demanding that she call her friends. And so Kelly did, and she rang up her friend Bob, who had been her co-worker and confidant. Wayne invited Bob to meet them for breakfast at a restaurant that had been just down the street in about 45 minutes, to which Bob agreed to do. Kelly went to get changed out of her pajamas, and Wayne followed her into the bedroom. It was there that Wayne raped her, leaving bruises on her back and wrists. He then told her to go get dressed, and the pair then walked down the street to the restaurant to meet Bob. At the restaurant, Kelly sat in silence as Wayne asked Bob if he knew any girls that he could introduce him to, preferably, quote, ones with large breasts. Quotes, Bob's just like flabbergasted. He's sitting there like, well, gee, I don't know, Wayne. I don't know of anybody offhand, but I'll keep my eye out. After they had finished the breakfast, Bob turned to Kelly and told her to drive his car to her house, pack her things, and that he'll take her away. And Kelly did just that. Bob then took a stroll with Wayne, as he had assumed that Wayne had called him to breakfast to fight with him. He asked Wayne if he wanted to fight, to which Wayne said that he didn't want to and that he was happy for him. Bob was confused by this, and his confusion got worse as they walked back to the house in which Kelly had already packed a bag. Wayne did nothing as Kelly left with Bob. A few days later, Wayne moved out of the property, but he didn't stop harassing and calling Kelly, who had moved to Pasadena. A couple of weeks after this incident, Bob and Kelly began dating and had properly moved in together, and Wayne had started stalking Kelly. Every day he would call Kelly and report that he'd seen her driving down a certain street, kissing Bob at a particular traffic light, or having dinner. Kelly and Bob eventually moved to Cathedral City, which had been near Palm Springs, to get away from Wayne. When Wayne couldn't find Kelly's new address, he started to harass her sister for it. Kelly then began the divorce proceedings with the hope that Wayne wouldn't fight her move to finalize the divorce in 6 months, which was around fall of 1983. But Wayne would still not let go of Kelly. He even showed up at her grandparents' ranch in Chino in 1985, telling her uncle that he had been an officer for the Norco Police Department, which is not even a real police department, and had asked to use the phone to report a car accident that he'd witnessed. He then tried to get Kelly's address, but her relatives pretended that they had no idea where she lived. Kelly would describe Wayne as being extremely narcissistic. Quotes, he did not, from my view, comprehend that there are moral rights and moral wrongs, as long as it felt good to him. When Wayne had gotten married to Kelly and been in the Marines, he hadn't seen his brother Rodney all too much. Rodney had joined the Navy in 1983 and had stayed in service until 1990. When Wayne and Rodney had finally spent time together following Wayne's separation from Kelly, he had noticed that Wayne had been acting aggressively and self-destructively. Quote, he'd come unglued, throw a fit, leave. If it wasn't his way, it wasn't going to happen. At the time, Wayne had told Rodney that he'd been driving very fast on his motorcycle when he missed a turn and hit a guardrail. He also told Rodney that he had wiped out while doing a wheelie several months later. When Rodney would later learn more about Wayne's head injury from 1980, he attributed these incidents, along with Wayne's increasingly aggressive behavior and hair-trigger temper, to that. Before the accident, Rodney would claim Wayne had gone four-wheeling and had rode his motorcycle, but always within safe, reasonable limits. Several months after Wayne and Kelly had separated, at 7:30 p.m. on the 8th of April 1983, Wayne was admitted to the Naval Hospital's psychiatric ward in Long Beach, where he was sent from the Marine base in El Toro after complaining of depression and problems adjusting to work. He blamed it all on his separation from Kelly. Wayne had stated on intake that he had no significant health issues other than when he was in the hospital in November of 1980 when, quote, I was run over on the freeway. Wayne checked every box available for emotional difficulties: anxiety, tension, restless, depression, irritability, etc. During his intake interview, Wayne told a nurse that he had been seeking treatment for depression and low self-esteem. He told the nurse that he'd been happy until he was 7 years old and his parents got a divorce. A drug test screening was conducted on the 9th of April, which showed Wayne to have no recreational or prescription drugs in his system. On the 10th of April, it was noted in his records by a nurse that Wayne had been passive-aggressive, and the doctor's summary stated that Wayne had a, quote, recent history of alcohol abuse, past history of explosiveness, mental exam revealed an angry Caucasian man in fatigues, patient stabilized quickly on ward without meds. The doctor recommended that Wayne be returned to full duty, but that he should follow up with outpatient group therapy. Wayne was subsequently discharged on the morning of the 11th of April, and there was no record of him going through with any additional group therapy. In May of 1984, Wayne was seen by another psychiatrist as an outpatient at the El Toro base. This psychiatrist diagnosed him with adjustment reaction with mixed features and a personality disorder with explosive and immature features. Wayne was returned once again to full duty. On the 27th of September, Wayne was found sitting in, quote, a catatonic-like state in his barracks. Apparently, even as he was being removed from the area, he refused to speak. He was taken to the hospital on the base where, during a physical examination, Wayne became violent and ran out. Wayne was then forcibly returned to the hospital, where he became so agitated that he had to be placed in 4-point restraints in a locked room and given shots of a psychotropic drug called Haldol. On the 29th of September, Wayne denies that he had tried to hurt himself or hospital staff before, but he did acknowledge that this had been his second psychiatric admission. During this admission, Wayne asked if this could affect his chances of becoming an attorney before expressing his desire to go to law school. Wayne didn't understand why he'd been placed on suicide watch. The following day, on the 30th of September, Wayne began to exhibit paranoia. He had asked a nurse, quote, do you put anything in the food here before we eat it? Only once the nurse reassured Wayne that they didn't put anything in his food did he actually eat all of his meals. By the 2nd of October, Wayne had been back with the rest of the patients and had been in a better mood, doing sit-ups and push-ups by the afternoon. One of the nurses had noted that Wayne's talk of becoming a lawyer seemed to have been rather grandiose given the situation, and wrote in his treatment plan that he should be encouraged to verbalize his feelings, quote, but towards a more realistic goal. 90 minutes after those notes, another nurse wrote that Wayne had started exhibiting the potential to harm himself or others and had become abusive, quote, I've been hearing gossip that I'm trying to seduce a 16-year-old girl. If anybody tries to accuse me of that, I'll break their fucking head. 6.5 hours later, Wayne was noted to have become cheerful, happy, and optimistic about his future again. On the 3rd of October, Wayne said that he'd been feeling some pain and hurt for the teenage girl as he knew what she'd been going through. The following day, on the 4th of October, Wayne had seemed upset in his group therapy and was having trouble controlling his anxiety. One of the nurses noted that Wayne had complained that the staff had been trying to, quote, control his mind and that we, the staff, were out to get him. The notes went on to say, quote, reassured patient that no one was here to hurt him. Received feedback from female patient who assured him that the staff weren't controlling anyone's minds or out to hurt anyone. Wayne had sworn that he hadn't harmed anybody as he became more and more agitated, quote, go ahead, give me the shot. You can't hurt me physically. That's what you're doing now, hurting me physically. Wayne was given medication, though he refused another dose of it, which saw him placed into seclusion. There, he refused to eat or speak and just began singing, praying, and pacing. Wayne was eventually placed in 4-point restraint before being given more Haldol. After 5 days of enduring medication and restraints, Wayne was noted to no longer be aggressive, though he had become depressed and tearful. By the time the 7th of October came around, Wayne had been noted to have been more cooperative. The staff subsequently reduced his restraints to just 2, and he would then be released from seclusion the following afternoon. He had become appreciative with a brighter and more alert mood. The next day, on the 9th of October, Wayne began to express anxiety about his future again, quote, now I won't be able to work where I want because of my hospitalization. Wayne was diagnosed by the doctor as having borderline personality disorder, quote, severe and chronic. The doctor further noted that he appeared to have recovered from the episode of, quote, acute decompensation. In the early hours of the following morning, at about 4 a.m, Wayne would call his uncle Jimmy up and tell him that he was coming home. After Wayne had spent 3.5 weeks in the Okinawa hospital, he was flown by medical plane to Letterman Army Hospital, which is located in Presidio in San Francisco. He was supposed to go to San Diego, but ended up in San Francisco, quote, due to an apparent lack of inpatient beds in Southern California. Wayne finally arrived at Letterman on the 21st of October, though his medical records had been lost in transit. Let's take a look at what the admitting doctor's initial impressions of Wayne had been. Quote, no evidence of a psychotic disorder presently. The etiology of this problem is unclear. An underlying personality disorder is likely, though uncertain. Before Wayne could be discharged from Letterman, he would receive a different diagnosis. Diagnosis, borderline personality disorder. Severe as manifested by intense and inappropriate anger and lack of control of anger, marks in shift in mood from normal to depression, irritability, and anxiety. Depression when alone and a chronic feeling of emptiness or boredom. Atypical psychosis manifested by frequent psychotic breaks, unmarked by hallucinations or a fixed delusional system, not caused by mind-altering drug. Ruled out schizophrenia, ruled out paranoid disorder. Wayne would then be transferred to Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in Oakland on the 23rd of October, where he'd stay for 2 days before being transferred to the Naval Hospital in San Diego on the 25th. And the doctors had still not received Wayne's medical records. In the intake interview, Wayne explained that he had been hospitalized in Okinawa because he, quote, was working 14 hours a day, 7 days a week without breaks, and so I broke. Wayne further reported that he'd been admitted to the Long Beach Naval Hospital in 1983 for, quote, homicidal ideations. 2 doctors, Dr. Faust Jr. and Dr. Ford, were on Wayne's case, and they noted their impressions of him. They noted that Wayne appeared to have not been a, quote, reliable historian about himself. Dr. Ford had stated that he has, quote, serious doubts that the head trauma that Wayne had endured in 1980 had been a contributing factor towards his current psychiatric issues. Quote, he describes his mother as a very religious person who later went to India to live and work with Mother Teresa. He left his mother to live with his father because the grass is always greener. He lived with his father for 1 year, after which time his father gave him his own apartment to live in at the age of 13. The patient states that he became a juvenile delinquent, engaging in car theft, burglary, and truancy. He was arrested at least twice and spent some period of time in juvenile hall on detention. At the age of 15, he bought a car and travelled around the country. He was then taken in by a woman of middle age and lived with her until the age of 17 when he joined the US Marine Corps, worked in electronics and did poorly, and then became a truck driver, which he quickly became bored with. Death. He became interested in NBC, liked it, and became the model Marine. He quickly progressed in rank to sergeant. He did well until his wife abandoned him for another man in 1982. Dr. Faust had written that Wayne's aggression and manipulation of fellow patients supported the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. Quote, he appears to have recovered fully from his previously decompensated and psychotic state, and further hospitalization does not appear warranted at this time. Dr. Faust concluded by stating that Wayne had not been in any mental condition to continue his service in the Marines, and so on the 31st of January 1985, Wayne was discharged from the military for, quote, the convenience of the government, character and behavior disorders. Following being kicked out of the military, Wayne found work driving delivery trucks for Sears and Ward's, and had lived with his uncle Jimmy. His uncle had also managed to get him a job repairing boats at a fishery in Eureka. It had been dirty work, but it had paid good money. But it had been far too dirty for Wayne, who soon quit the job and moved to Southern California. Quote, Wayne always had the attitude that he was better, not than anybody else. Well, he did have a very high opinion of himself for some reason, and that type of work was beneath him. It had been at around the same time that Wayne had started calling himself by his middle name, Adam, just as his mother had done. Though it must be noted that we will continue to address him using his first name Wayne in order to avoid any confusion. In 1986, Wayne found work as a driver's helper, which entailed loading trucks at American Delivery Service in Garden Grove. And it had been there that Wayne would meet a girl by the name of Wadad Radwan. Wadad had been in her late teens and had worked in the customer service office. Wayne asked Wadad out for a coffee one day, and from there, their relationship progressed. Now, Wayne never held down any job for very long. He worked a multitude of jobs, including delivering papers for the Orange County Register, selling cars at 2 dealerships, working at a motorcycle shop, driving a school bus for disabled children in San Capistrano, and working as a tow truck driver and security guard. Wayne's relationship with Wadad would last about 6 years and had been very off and on. It was plagued with breakups, stints of living together, and even an engagement. They hadn't been dating long when they had gotten into a massive argument that saw them split up for a couple of weeks. Wayne would then move in with his friends they had met in the Marines, then move back in with Wadad when they'd made up, then back in with his friend again, then back with Wadad. It was a vicious and continuous cycle. Wadad, on the other hand, would live with her mother whenever the relationship was on the rocks. She simply just wanted Wayne to be happy. Though, just like in his relationship with Kelly, Wayne's sexual practices with Wadad started off normally. He initially asked for oral sex, but Wadad declined. Quote, I can't do something like that if I don't love you. This did upset Wayne at the time, but he didn't take it out on her. And it hadn't been long before Wadad fell in love with Wayne. Wadad then became more and more willing to do what she needed to do in order to please Wayne. This would include letting him put a safety pin in her nipple during sex. Despite the pain, Wadad would allow Wayne to do this on 4 separate occasions. Wayne never pushed it all the way through, just pricking her with it. And he would later tell a psychologist that he'd administered diabetic injections to one of his teenage girlfriends, and over time, the needles had become sexually arousing to him. A major difference between the sexual relationship with Wadad and Kelly had been that Wayne never forced Wadad to have sex when she didn't want to. Much later, a woman by the name of Janice Hawkins would disclose to the authorities that she had met Wayne at a karaoke bar in Vallejo in October of 1987. According to Janice, Wayne had actually lived with her for a time and she would engage in a sexual relationship with him. Wayne would ask Janice to pinch his nipples so hard she feared she would pinch them off. Janice also disclosed that Wayne had hit her once while they were having sex, and that Wayne had allegedly masturbated in front of her teenage daughter. In 1989, Wayne and Wadad had been living together in a 2-bedroom house in San Clemente, and they had both been aware that their relationship was not destined to last, and that they hadn't been good for one another. And so they decided the best thing to do would be to break up. It was then that Wayne had the strange idea, quote, why don't we just break up slowly? I'll sleep in the other bedroom. And this was an idea that Wadad went along with. Wayne moved into the other bedroom and they lived together just like roommates would do, though they had been intimate on occasion. This arrangement lasted about a year as Wayne had supposedly been trying to find somewhere else to live. Wadad had told him that she wanted to keep the house as she had a dog. It had been at around the same time period that Wayne had told his older brother Rodney that he'd enrolled in pre-law courses at Saddleback College. He had dreams of one day becoming a criminal defense attorney. It's unclear what his progress had been with those classes. One day, Wayne came back to the home that he'd shared with Wadad crying and refused to tell Wadad what had been wrong. Eventually, Wayne explains that he had been walking along the pavement when he'd come across a girl, grabbed her purse and threw it on the roof, and bit her breast. Wadad was very confused and couldn't understand why Wayne would do that. but she didn't push him for any explanation as he had already been crying. Wydad would later state that other strange things would happen at around the same time too. While Wayne had been working as a tow truck driver and helping people on the road, one night, a young teenage couple from out of state had come up to him and told him that they had no money, that they needed to buy some fuel. Wayne actually brought this couple back to the house where they sat around the kitchen table playing cards. Wydad ended up coming home one day to find Wayne sitting at an angle and facing the girl who'd been about 15 years old. Wayne had been shirtless and wearing cut-off shorts with no underwear, and so his testicles had been hanging out of the bottom. Wydad tried to signal to Wayne to cover himself, but he remained oblivious, up until Wydad decided to say something to him. She felt that Wayne had been disrespectful, though she would later realise that Wayne had likely enjoyed watching a 15-year-old girl react to his exposed genitals. Finally, after a year of, quote, looking for a place, Wayne finally announced that he'd found somewhere to live. Wydad asked him where his new place is, and that's when he pointed to the house next door. Wydad was, understandably, outraged, and she quickly realised that she would have to move somewhere to get away from Wayne. And so she managed to find a studio flat in San Clemente, and unfortunately, Wydad had to leave her dog behind. After Wydad moved, Wayne had started going out a lot to karaoke bars and drinking a lot. The pair continued to be intimate every now and then up until the end of 1982, which had been when Wayne told Wydad that he'd slept with somebody else, and that was a hard stop for Wydad. Quote, I told him I didn't want any part of him after that. In March of 1993, Wayne called up Rodney and told him that he'd been arrested on suspicion of firing a weapon and for cruelty to animals. Wayne told Rodney over the phone that two Dobermans that belonged to next door had been barking constantly and had been trying to get under the fence between their two properties. Wayne alleged that the Dobermans were trying to get a hold of Wydad's dog. He explained that he'd repeatedly warned the owner of the two dogs about what he would do if the dogs got into his yard. Quote, you need to fix the fence. If they get in here and hurt my dog, I'm going to kill them. Sadly, one of the dogs did get through the fence and ended up in a fight with Wydad's dog. Wayne initially tried to separate them, but he'd been unable to, and so went inside, grabbed his shotgun, and killed the Doberman. Wayne would be sentenced to 5 days in jail for cruelty to animals, though it must be noted that it's unclear whether or not he served any time. When Wydad would reflect on the relationship she had with Wayne, she was shocked at why she'd stayed in the relationship. Quote, I think I was just waiting for him to make the right move in his life, but he never did it. I waited till I was 26 and I woke up that morning on my birthday and thought, what am I doing here? She'd go on to say, quote, I don't think he respects women, period. Wydad speculated that Wayne had acted the way he had due to his relationship with his mother. According to Wydad, Wayne had told her that he'd been very close to his mother Karen, hanging on her dress in the kitchen as a child. And then one day, quote, she just looked at him and said, I don't want to be your mother anymore. And she left. She just left. Rodney would later agree with Wydad's opinion of Wayne, quote, something happened when he got kicked out of the house by our mother. He didn't trust women anymore. And that's as far as I can see when he started having problems with women. Rodney would also describe Wydad as a very nice person, one of the best people that he had ever met, and that she'd always gotten on well with Rodney's wife, so much so that the four of them used to go to car shows together. Quote, we just loved her to death. Wydad was the best and healthiest thing that ever happened to my brother. Wayne would later look back on his time with Wydad and describe her as the love of his life. In early 1994, Wayne had been employed as a disc jockey for a Japanese sushi restaurant and bar in San Clemente. One of Wayne's friends at the time, a man called Dave, had been dating a 21-year-old woman by the name of Elizabeth, though the relationship between Dave and Elizabeth hadn't been destined to last, with the couple breaking up with each other after only a few months. After that breakup, Elizabeth began going to the bar in order to see Wayne. At the end of May of 1994, Wayne and Elizabeth began dating one another, getting close very quickly. After just a few months, the couple had been living together. Before long, they had started talking about getting married, something they were both set on. As those discussions of marriage evolved, the couple had something more pressing on hand to deal with, and that was that Elizabeth had been pregnant. Wayne and Elizabeth discussed with each other whether they should keep the baby, with Wayne leaving the decision about the abortion to Elizabeth due to the fact that they hadn't been married yet, and Elizabeth subsequently decided to go through with the procedure. The wedding plans progressed thereafter, and on the 15th of October 1994, Wayne and Elizabeth got married at the Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas, with Wayne's best man being Rodney. Interestingly, before the ceremony, Rodney had actually expressed how he felt about the marriage to Wayne, apparently with Elizabeth's brother and father, who works for the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, in the room. Rodney told Wayne, quote, you shouldn't marry her. She's too young. She's too volatile. You've already had problems and I don't see it getting any better. Now, Wayne didn't heed Rodney's warnings and still got married to Elizabeth despite them. Not long after the wedding, on the request of Elizabeth, Wayne stopped working at the Japanese sushi restaurant and bar, as it hadn't been the kind of, quote, scene to be working in when you're married. Despite quitting his job there, the newlyweds would frequent the bar still. One day, the couple had been talking with each other about their pasts, and curious about Wayne's time in the Marines, Elizabeth asked him whether he had ever killed anyone. Wayne responded by saying that he hadn't, but that one night in 1992, he had hurt a girl, quote, pretty badly, in a bar in St. Clement. He told Elizabeth that somebody had jumped on his back while he had been at the bar, and so he turned around and out of instinct, quote, decked the person. It was only after doing so that he had realized that the person that he had, quote, decked had been a young Latina woman whose jaw was now dangling due to the punch. He claims that he had immediately ran out of the bar and driven off in his red Jeep, which he had repainted to blue, as according to him, the girl had been part of a Mexican gang and he didn't want her, quote, fellow gangsters to track him down by his car and get revenge. Now, just like in Wayne's previous relationships, it had not been long until Wayne had wanted to start exploring more in their sex life. And not long after the wedding, Wayne told Elizabeth that he wanted to watch her have sex with another man. Initially, Elizabeth refused his request, but she actually ended up changing her mind after he argued with her, making her life a living hell. Quote, I can't even put it into words. It would just make life so bad that I thought, if this will make him happy, and it's stupid on my part, you know I've made some mistakes in my life. And I just thought maybe it would get our life back to normal. Elizabeth simply wanted to make her husband happy and hoped to get past this fantasy of his. And so one night, Elizabeth got drunk enough to numb her feelings, and then Wayne and Elizabeth picked up a Marine from a bus stop and went back to the barracks. There, the three of them had sex, but, quote, the men didn't touch each other. The morning after, Wayne had been very proud of Elizabeth. She looked at him and told him that she never wanted to do it ever again, though she would do it 2 more times. And each time, Wayne's afterglow would only last for about a week. It all came to a head after the final time when Elizabeth told him she couldn't do it again. Quote, it's awful. I don't know why you would want to do that to me. Wayne would respond, quote, well, don't you want to make me happy? And making Wayne happy had been something that Elizabeth had found hard to do. If he didn't get 8 hours of sleep, he would blame Elizabeth and then refuse to go to work. Elizabeth would end up sleeping on the couch for most of the time. By March of 1995, Elizabeth found herself pregnant again. And during this pregnancy, Elizabeth found it difficult to have much appetite until the evening. One morning in August of 1995, she found herself to have been unusually hungry, and so she made herself some egg, bacon, and toast. She then settled in on the sofa to eat her breakfast while she watched some TV, but Wayne decided that he wanted to eat the food that she'd made rather than cook for himself. He also wanted to have sex. Quote, what he expected of me as a wife was to cook his breakfast and cook his lunch and cook his dinner. If he had to go to work without his breakfast, he was pissed at me, whether or not I was sick. But this time round, Wayne's anger came out a different way. Quote, he just took control of me and he raped me. It was bad. I didn't want anything to do with him. I just wanted him away from me, and he took a belt and wrapped it around my neck and told me to suck his dick. And I wanted to bite it off, but I didn't want to get killed or anything. That was the only time I was really frightened of him. He hit me with the belt, he got on top of me, and I felt like I was going to die. Elizabeth ran out of the apartment naked, screaming, and into the laundry room, which was where she grabbed a towel and covered herself up. Wayne got scared and demanded her come back inside and told her it would be okay, to which Elizabeth refused to do so. It was then that she looked around and saw a young boy had been watching her, and so she went back into the apartment as she didn't want to cause a scene. Elizabeth then took a shower and let Wayne have sex with her. She lay there lifeless, letting him do what he wanted, hoping it would make things better, and afterwards she cried. After all of that took place, on that same day, Wayne and Elizabeth drove up to Pomona to see Rodney, his wife and his kids, so that they could all go to a classic car show. They acted as if nothing had happened. Other than this instance of rape, Wayne had never been violent with Elizabeth, even when she'd hit him during an argument. Wayne had been happy about the baby and the pregnancy once he found out that the baby had been a boy. Elizabeth would later state that she didn't know what they would have done if the baby turned out to be a girl. When Elizabeth went into labor and had to go to hospital, Wayne seemed to have been very put out that he also had to go along with her. And so on the 10th of December 1995, Wayne and Elizabeth welcomed their son Max into the world. Not long after Max was born, the family moved to Las Vegas in order to pursue better job opportunities. The young family moved in February of 1996 and stayed with Elizabeth's mother until they could get their own apartment in the same complex the following month. Once Wayne and Elizabeth had been alone again, Wayne started asking Elizabeth to talk to him about becoming a sex worker. As Elizabeth had never been a sex worker, she didn't understand Wayne's new sex game and refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. Wayne ended up finding work as an apprentice for the electricians union, but he then decided that he'd rather drive a cab. Meanwhile, Elizabeth stayed in their 2-bedroom apartment looking after Max. She kept the house clean, did the laundry, and cooked for Wayne just as he wanted. Elizabeth began to detach from herself emotionally as the sex games progressed. On one occasion, Elizabeth let Wayne tie her wrists together, but she said she wouldn't do it again as she didn't like feeling confused. find. And on several occasions, Wayne had put his hands around Elizabeth's neck as he was reaching climax. As the marriage progressed, Wayne became more and more unhappy. He was described as being constantly depressed, holding on to things and not letting them go. Wayne started to make Elizabeth drink vodka straight from the bottle until she threw up. Wayne even then began talking about placing a padlock on Elizabeth's vagina so that no one else could get inside, and then started asking whether he could pierce Elizabeth's breasts with safety pins. Elizabeth figured that if she let Wayne do it once, then he'd be satisfied and move on. But Wayne wasn't satisfied with just the once, and so she would continue to let him use the safety pins on her just for a minute. Quote, "That really hurts. I don't want to go through with this. Why would you want to do this to me? I don't like it." It quickly became clear that this behavior had been something Wayne needed, and it was something that Elizabeth couldn't withstand. On top of that, Elizabeth strongly disliked the way in which Wayne would be constantly pleasuring himself on the couch, especially when she caught him in the act. This all came to a head in June of 1996 when Elizabeth decided that she couldn't take it anymore, and so she moved with the baby Max upstairs to her mother's apartment, which had been in the same complex, for a week just to get a break. When Elizabeth moved upstairs, Wayne began to plead with her and promised that things would be different. Little did Wayne know that Elizabeth had been working on herself and building her confidence. This led Elizabeth to give Wayne an ultimatum, and so he had 2 weeks to prove he could change. Quote, "The way you live is not right, and I am going to work." Elizabeth also told him that he wasn't going to be given his meals on the table whenever he wanted them, as she had other things to do. Quote, "I don't know what's wrong with you, but I'm not going to live like this." And Wayne tried to meet Elizabeth's demands for a day or two, but once he had seen that Elizabeth had been serious about working and not being his domestic slave, he went back to acting depressed. On the 4th of July 1996, Wayne and Elizabeth went to a party at the top of the Stratosphere Hotel and Casino, and 2 days later, on the 6th of July 1996, Elizabeth left Wayne for good. She moved in with her mother as she didn't have enough money for a deposit on her own apartment. And on the following month, Elizabeth met a man and went to stay at his place in Green Valley, though Elizabeth's father didn't approve of this new living arrangement. And so, in October of 1996, Elizabeth and Max moved in with Elizabeth's father. By that point, Wayne had Rodney and Jean pick him up in a motorhome and take him back to California, towing his broken down Jeep behind them. Wayne then lived with his father in Napa for a few months before he moved down to South California. He'd been in Vallejo at the Blue Rock Inn, where Wayne had found work at a karaoke company that he met another woman, and this woman and Wayne soon began dating. And after a couple of months, Wayne moved into her trailer. While they were living together, Wayne told this woman that his ex-wife, quote, destroyed their family when she left him for another man. Wayne talks about wanting to kill Elizabeth and often told her, quote, "I know I'm going to hell," but he didn't elaborate. Wayne lived with this woman until he moved to his grandmother's house in Eureka in September of 1997, which is when he went long distance with the woman he had been dating. One night in January of 1998, the woman's nephew got, quote, pretty wasted with Wayne on rum and coke, and Wayne told this nephew that he, quote, hated women, that his wife took his kid away from him, and that he wanted to cut them up, dismember them, and hide everything that would identify them. This nephew would later state that he had been intoxicated at the time, so he wasn't sure if Wayne had been talking about what he wanted to do to women, or if he'd been confessing to something he'd already done. Whatever the case, the nephew told his aunt that Wayne was evil and that she should stop seeing him. The woman did end up ending the relationship with Wayne during a visit to Eureka the following month, when Wayne told her that he was in love with her 20-year-old daughter and that he wanted to have a child with her. 2 months later, Wayne showed up at the woman's trailer and argued with her, and after that, she never heard from Wayne again. Sometime after splitting up with Elizabeth, Wayne started calling his mother Karen, who was now going by her new married name. You see, Karen had moved back and forth to India before eventually settling in Austin, Texas. Wayne would always call his mother late at night. The first phone conversation had gone like this, quote, "I'm sorry, Mum, I'm calling you so late. It doesn't matter. I'm glad you called. How are you and what are you doing?" Over the course of the next 90 minutes, Wayne and his mother, Karen, cried together as they talked about Wayne's feelings, that his mother didn't love him and that she had, quote, deserted him. Karen told Wayne that she loved him and apologized for not showing it more. Wayne responded by saying that she abandoned him. Karen told Wayne that it had been him that had wanted to leave and that she didn't want him to leave. Wayne later told Karen about how lonely he was and how people had been hurting him. Quote, "Whenever I open my heart, whenever I'm honest with people, whenever I more or less reach out to them, they stab me." Karen could see that Wayne had been beating himself up, but she didn't want to say anything that could push him away from their reconnection. She couldn't help but wonder whether Wayne had been having some kind of psychological breakdown, and so she asked Wayne whether he wanted to come and stay for a few days, but he told her that he couldn't. She then told him that he could call her collect again anytime. Karen would try calling Wayne, but nobody ever answered. It was several more months before Karen would hear from Wayne again, but this time the call had come in between midnight and 1 a.m. and Wayne had been crying. He told Karen that he was angry that people were persecuting him, but he refused to elaborate any further. Wayne also complained to his mum that he was lonely without a girlfriend, to which Karen told him that he just needed to get back out there and make some friends. In December of 1996, Wayne traveled to Las Vegas with some relatives to see his son Max for his birthday. You see, Wayne had been proud that he shared a birthday with his son in the same week, and so Wayne had bought his son Max a tricycle with a big helmet. It must be noted that Max had only been a year old and could barely walk. Elizabeth had felt torn. When she called Wayne to encourage him to be more involved in his son's life, all he wanted to do was talk about getting back together. Wayne had always blamed Elizabeth for his not being in Max's life, reminding her that she was the one that had left. Quote, "So he frickin' moves to California and makes it completely impossible to have a normal relationship." Now, at some point in 1997, Wayne had called up Elizabeth and had told her that he was going to Las Vegas to see Max. Wayne and Elizabeth came up with a plan for Elizabeth to drop Max off at the child care center where Wayne could spend some supervised time with his son. Elizabeth had always feared that Wayne might kidnap their son. Elizabeth had hoped that she would avoid bumping into Wayne, but he had been there when she'd arrived with Max. And so she suggested that they go get something to eat at a nearby McDonald's while Max got used to being around and being with his father. Wayne began to tear up as they sat in the restaurant. Quote, "I just miss you." Elizabeth didn't want to get into it, and since Max seemed fine with Wayne, she told him to go ahead and take Max for the day and then drop him off later at childcare. Later on, Elizabeth went for sushi with her boyfriend, then called the childcare center to make sure that Wayne had already been and gone. She asked them if Wayne had dropped Max off, and they told her that he had, but Max didn't want to stay, so Wayne was still there. Eventually, Wayne left Max inside, but he sat in his car outside for a while. On the 14th of October 1997, Elizabeth and Max met up with Wayne so that Wayne and Max could have a visit mediated by Wayne's friends, Scott and Linda Hayes. The three of them took a trip with the Hayes family to a pumpkin patch where they spent the afternoon, and where Wayne and Max went on a half-hour stroll along the shoreline. Scott thought that Wayne appeared excited to see his son, and that although Wayne had been cordial to Elizabeth, he could see Wayne's lingering disappointment about the separation. Wayne had also told Scott that he hadn't been happy that Elizabeth had shaved Max's head bald. Wayne left in a mood after the 6-hour visit with the family he'd lost. Nobody would know just how much the visit had upset him until it came out more than a year later that afterwards he went on to brutally murder and dismember the woman known as Torso Girl to the local investigators. Wayne had worked 3 days a week at a cement and gravel mining plant on the Mad River, 7 miles north of Eureka, and on Halloween night of 1997, a handful of days after the Torso Girl was discovered, Wayne had been having dinner with his family, and the topic of the Torso Girl case had come up in conversation due to it being discussed heavily in the media, and one of his aunts had asked who would do such a thing. One of his family members would later recall that Wayne simply said nothing and just looked down at his dinner plate. As we know, 25 days later, on the 25th of November 1997, Karen Mitchell would go missing and be connected to the Torso Girl case. And on the 5th of December 1997, Wayne would walk into a mental health clinic in Eureka. During the intake interview, Wayne said that he'd suffered from severe depression for most of his life and described his crying spells, thoughts of suicide, multiple aches and pains, and feelings of hopelessness and agitation and recurrent insomnia. In his medical notes, it was noted that when Wayne would become depressed, he would abruptly leave his job and that he had problems maintaining relationships. Quote, "Patient had been using alcohol more, binge while he was singing in bars." Wayne said that he drank half a beer every few weeks and that he'd been obsessively focusing on his thoughts, which disrupted his sleep and judgment. To the staff, Wayne came across as negative and sad, describing activities that were clearly doomed to fail. It's important to note that Wayne never once mentioned killing or wanting to kill anybody. Wayne was subsequently diagnosed with dysthymia, a low-grade depression that could possibly be more serious. With histrionic, displays exaggerated emotional responses, dependent, allows other people to meet his needs, and narcissistic, uses other people as objects to meet his needs features. He was then referred for psychiatric evaluation, but after the staff psychiatrist spoke with Wayne, he decided that Wayne should undergo counselling before trying medication. And so Wayne made an appointment for counselling on the 18th of December 1997, but he never showed up. In early 1998, Wayne got a job at Edeline Trucking and was assigned truck number 60, which had a 45-foot flatbed for transporting freight, and he started driving that night. Wayne didn't own a car, and so he essentially lived in the sleeper portion portion of the cab, driving over to the trailer park to do his laundry. On the 15th of April 1998, Wayne and Elizabeth's divorce, custody and visitation agreement was finalized. Wayne was permitted to visit Max for 1 week every 3 months, on the child's birthday, on Christmas in even-numbered years, and for the month of December in odd-numbered years. Though it must be noted that Wayne never exercised those rights. And for someone who was apparently so upset that Elizabeth was taking the son away from him, it seemed like he truly didn't actually want to be part of Max's life. As part of the settlement, Wayne agreed to send child support payments of $200 a month. In late May, Elizabeth heard some strange clicks on her answering machine, which she assumed had been from Wayne calling and hanging up. The following weekend, Elizabeth and Wayne spoke for the first time in a while, and the conversation went well. Wayne told Elizabeth that he'd been in town for the weekend just gone, though Elizabeth was upset that Wayne, who had only come to Las Vegas 2 or 3 times to see his son Max since the separation, hadn't called ahead to arrange a visit for when he had been in town. It would be 5 more months before Elizabeth would learn exactly what Wayne had been doing in Las Vegas that weekend in May. It was the murder of Tina Renee Gibbs. In July, August and September, Wayne would leave messages on Elizabeth's answering machine in which he apologized for sending his $200 check late. The checks would always come in about 2 weeks late, and Wayne had started writing, quote, the money cow in the top left-hand corner where the return address would normally go. The last time he left such a message had been in September of 1998, when his check arrived on the 28th day of the month. And in October of 1998, Elizabeth didn't receive a check at all. Now in this case, there had been a handful of near misses that I would like to discuss with you when it comes to Wayne. The first of which is the case of Orange County Doe. On the 16th of June 1998, Wayne picked up a sex worker in Anaheim, California, who was later dubbed Orange County Doe in order to keep her identity private. She told the authorities that she'd been working at the corner of Beach and Lincoln Boulevards when she was approached by Wayne in a gas station parking lot. She said that she'd been paid $40 to sit in Wayne's truck while he masturbated. She further told the authorities that she had agreed to perform oral sex for $35. Though once she had gotten into the truck, she quickly realized that Wayne had other things in mind. Wayne told her to get into the sleeper where nobody could see them, and they both removed their clothes. Wayne told the woman to get on her hands and knees in front of him before grabbing her arms and tying them behind her back with one end of a nylon rope. He then tied the other end of the rope around her neck, after which he took another rope, pushed her knees to her chest, and bound her wrists and ankles together. Wayne told her not to struggle as it would only make things worse. He then proceeded to gag her, burn her breasts and vagina with a cigarette lighter, poke her genitals with a sharp instrument, and sit on her face. After doing so, Wayne took a break from the assault on the woman to drive around for a while before returning back to the sleeper where he raped her. Once he was done, Wayne went through the woman's purse and took all of her money. And when he dropped her off, he told her that she was lucky as the others had not survived. Now, after the events of the Orange County Doe took place, Wayne paid a visit to Scott and Linda Hayes' house on the 21st of August at about 4 p.m. Wayne stayed with them for a couple of days, during which time he managed to talk Scott out of his favorite knife, which was a hunting knife that he kept in a special case. Scott and Linda would later note that they found it weird that Wayne wouldn't let anyone near his truck until he'd cleaned it. They also noticed that Wayne drank a lot on the visit and that he didn't change his clothes or clean for 3 days. After Wayne left the Hayes' house, Scott and Linda would never hear from him again. On the 23rd of August at around 11 p.m, a 22-year-old woman known as Sonoma County Doe, who we'll call Jane Doe for this section, had been standing in front of the Monte Vista Model on Santa Rosa Avenue with a handful of other sex workers when she saw a big, shiny, and dark truck pull up. It had been Wayne driving this truck, who reached over and pushed open the passenger door, which Jane Doe took to have been an invitation to get in. Wayne proceeded to hand Jane Doe money, which she then tucked into her sock. The pair then drove around for a while, predominantly looking for a place to park his massive truck. When she realized that Wayne was struggling to find somewhere to park, Jane Doe suggested they park in the Friedman Brothers parking lot, which was large and would be empty at that time of night. And so that was where Wayne parked. He'd introduced himself to Jane Doe as Adam, his middle name. The pair proceeded to engage in sexual acts, but it hadn't been working for Wayne, and so Jane Doe switched positions. Wayne told her that it would turn him on if she put her hands behind her back and grabbed her butt, and so she did, but as soon as she did so, Wayne grabbed her and bound her hands together with rope. Jane Doe had not agreed to any bondage or kinks like that, and so she started to panic, quote, "Somebody help me, why are you doing this?" Wayne subsequently ordered Jane Doe to shut up, quote, "If you scream, I'll kill you. I'll knock your teeth down your throat." Jane Doe started crying, which only made Wayne angrier, quote, shut up, I'll give you something to cry about." Wayne then proceeded to rape Jane Doe. According to Jane Doe, it happened 4 or 5 times. Afterwards, Wayne stopped his truck at the side of the freeway, walked Jane Doe down the hillside, and hog-tied her, putting one of his neckties around her neck. Wayne then went through Jane Doe's purse and stole $400 in cash, then gave some of it back to her. Jane Doe couldn't remember whether it was a $20 bill or her original $100 fee for the sex, but Wayne had given it back to Jane Doe so that she could get home. Quote, "Once I set you down, don't be trying to get out of them, the ropes, real fast. I don't want you to get up off the side of the hill and see my license plates." Now, ironically, Wayne had tied the rope so loosely around Jane Doe's hands that she had already freed them by the time she'd gotten out of the truck. Jane Doe then waited until she heard Wayne pull away before she removed the rope from around her ankles and scrambled up the hillside. When Jane Doe saw that it had been safe to do so, she climbed the rest of the way to the freeway. A trucker then saw her, pulled over and drove her to the next freeway exit where she called her pimp and then dialed for 911. Jane Doe made the calls from a pay phone outside a market in Cloverdale, which was at least 200 miles up Highway 101 from the Friedman Brothers parking lot. When a Cloverdale police officer arrived, Jane Doe had still been clutching the rope and necktie. Once the officers realized that the rapes had occurred in the Sonoma County Sheriff's jurisdiction, he turned her over to a deputy who took her to Sutter Hospital. While she waited, Sheriff's Detective Dennis O'Leary from the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Unit interviewed her. Joanne Kasmer had been the nurse who examined Jane Doe, and she later said that out of the 175 rape victims that she'd seen in her career, Jane Doe had been the most severely injured of them all. Jane Doe cried, but had been cooperative throughout the 4-hour examination, which started at 5:45 a.m. She cried and held her face in her hands as she recounted the night's events to Joanne Kasmer, who took the vaginal swab that would later be matched to Wayne's DNA. The nurse made note of Jane Doe's injuries, which included bruises on her face, right breast and neck, a cut on her lip, swelling on the side of her face, linear red marks and swelling on her wrists, rope burns on her ankles, abrasions and burns to her genitals. The nurse also noted that Jane Doe had been far too sore to let the nurse complete a rectal exam. Jane Doe had also complained of wrist pain and was unable to move her bruised thumb as it had hurt too much. About a week later, Jane Doe gave a description to a sketch artist, and a couple of months later, after Wayne had handed himself in, she managed to identify him from a photo lineup. Wayne would ultimately let a handful of his victims go free, all of them with a similar tale to tell. After Wayne turned himself in on the 3rd of November 1998, he was arrested on suspicion of mayhem. The following day, on the 4th of November, he was interviewed by the detectives for hours on end. Wayne was placed in a padded cell and placed on the suicide watch due to his unstable emotional state, and was prescribed medications to calm him down. It was also on the 4th of November that the story was released to the public, though it didn't reveal much detail. It must be noted that the fact that Wayne had turned himself in with a breast had been leaked to the press. Also on the 4th of November, Wayne took the police to the place where he had buried Torso Girls' legs. On the 5th of November, people that knew Wayne expressed their reactions to the news to the press, with some neighbors telling stories about Wayne that had been untrue, possibly for attention. That same day, Wayne met with a psychologist to undergo an evaluation. On the 6th of November 1998, Wayne was arraigned at Humboldt County Superior Court for 1 murder. In December of 1998, he was indicted on a single count of first-degree murder for the death of Jane Doe, with a trial being set for the following July. In June of 1999, after a lengthy investigation, Wayne was arrested on 4 counts of murder in the first degree. In October of 1999, Wayne was transferred to the West Valley Detention Center in Rancho Cucamonga. The legal process in this case would be naturally very lengthy, with the next notable event occurring in January of 2004. It was in that January that Judge Michael Smith ruled that most of Wayne's confessions were admissible in court, though any confessions that were made after the 5th of November 1998 were ruled inadmissible. On the 17th of January 2006, the jury in the trial was selected after 900 people were screened, 6 men and 6 women were selected with 6 alternates. And finally, on the 13th of March 2006, the trial against Wayne commenced. By April 12th of that same year, the prosecution finished their case, and on the 24th of April, the defense began their case. On the 15th of May 2006, Wayne underwent a psychological exam and was found to have been only slightly more psychotic than the average inmate. On the 14th of June, the prosecution delivered their closing arguments that lasted 2 hours 15 minutes, with the defense delivering their closing arguments the following day on the 15th. June 19th saw the jury, which had now been 7 women and 5 men, begin their deliberations. The jury reached their verdict on the 27th of June. They found Wayne Adam Ford guilty of 4 counts of murder in the first degree. The sentencing trial against Wayne Adam Ford then commenced on July 12th, with the jury deciding on the sentence on the 10th of August. On the 17th of October, Wayne Adam Ford was interviewed for a pre-sentence report, which he claims that he was very sorry, but he does not think he was guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder, but he was guilty of 4 accidental murders. Whatever the case, in February of 2007, the judge decided that there should be no retrial, and Wayne Adam Ford's sentencing of the death penalty was upheld. He was then transported to San Quentin Prison. Wayne Adam Ford Ford remains on death row to this day. Now, something that the authorities still hadn't established had been the identity of the remains dubbed Torso Girl. Thankfully, in December of 2022, the HSCO and the California Department of Justice partnered with Othram Inc., which is a forensic genealogy lab that I've actually mentioned before on this channel, to see if advanced forensic DNA testing could help reveal the identity of the remains. Quote, "The case was determined to be eligible for advanced forensic DNA testing, and the HCSO sent Othram a DNA extract from the remains. Othram scientists used forensic genome sequencing to build a comprehensive DNA profile for the female. Utilizing this profile and forensic genealogy, a potential DNA match was developed for a close relative. Investigators contacted the relative, inquiring if they had any missing family members. The relative stated that their family member, Kerry, had been missing since the mid-1990s. HCSO investigators were able to track down Kerry's sister, who confirmed that Kerry's last contact with family was in 1997. Kathy provided investigators with a DNA sample, which was then compared to the DNA sample from the unknown female's remains. These DNA profiles were confirmed to be a genealogical match, officially identifying the remains as that of Kerry Ann Cummings, born in 1972. During her last contact with her family in 1997, Kerry was suffering from untreated mental illness and told family that she was couch surfing in the Eugene, Oregon area. Despite multiple offers from her family, she refused to come home. Quote, "Kerry was beautiful, funny, smart, and an artist. She was great at making us laugh," Kerry's sister Kathy Cummings told investigators. "It is devastating what mental illness can do in a span of only 2 short years." Kathy told investigators that after Kerry went missing, her parents tried to report her as missing in Arizona and Oregon, and even hired a private investigator. But due to laws surrounding the reports of missing persons at that time, a missing persons report was never taken. Therefore, Kerry was never listed as a missing person or entered into any national missing persons databases. Quote, "Unfortunately, back then, they were told that Kerry was an adult, that she had chosen the lifestyle, and that if she wasn't a threat to herself or others, there was nothing that law enforcement could do. As the internet expanded, I took to searching the Nameless website when I was missing her, scanning for mention of her tattoo and searching through the pictures of the Jane Does. She was dearly loved. The Humboldt County Coroner's Division is working with family members to release Kerry's remains for burial with other deceased family members." Quote, "I'd like to thank the California Department of Justice DNA Lab and Othram for once again providing outstanding work and assistance in solving this case," Sheriff William Honsel said. "While we can't take away the pain of loss, we can hope that this identification can help bring closure to Kerry's family and the community. I'm thankful for the dedication of our investigators who never gave up on Kerry and continue to seek resolution for the outstanding cases that remain to be solved. It's unknown just how many victims Wayne had, but we can only hope that the family and friends of the 4 victims identified have felt justice has been served." Those victims were 25-year-old Kerry Ann Cummings, 26-year-old Tina Renee Gibbs, 25-year-old Lynette Dean White, 29-year-old Patricia Tamers. And that's everything that I have for you in this mammoth of a case. Thank you so much for watching this multi-part series. I really appreciate it. If you have a case that you want me to cover on this channel, go to requestacase.com and send in your case submissions there. Be sure to subscribe to this channel if you want to see more true crime videos just like this one, and hit that bell icon so you can be notified every single time I post a brand new true crime video. And with all that being said, I will see you in the next case. And Fred also says bye too. Hello, little one.